Chapter 348. But he asked what was that him like. Jin Wan's hand was pressed against the man's chest, her heart beating abnormally, and she was really immersed in that dream. In the dream, the man who suddenly rushed in the moment she fell to the ground with blood dripping from the corner of her mouth was not much different from him now, except that his hair was shorter and finer than it was now. 10 years had not left any trace on his body at all. She couldn't see his expression clearly in the dream, just like how she couldn't touch him in those 10 years. He was very far away and unreachable. Jin Wan answered gloomily in his arms, "Anyway, he's handsome." The man's slender fingers suddenly straightened her face, his forehead pressed against hers, and he said hoarsely, "Really?" Jin Wan suddenly didn't dare to look into his eyes. She glanced at him and hurriedly nodded. "Really?" Mo Jingshan pinched her chin, lowered his head, and kissed her. When he was done, he purposely bit down on her lips and licked the corner of her lips. "Do I kiss you like this in your dreams?" Jin Wan? Of course not. That him was someone she couldn't even see if she wanted to. She pressed her back against the bed, closed her eyes, and turned her back to him, answering vaguely, "Anyway, I'm not as naughty as you are now. I'm going to sleep. Aren't you sleepy? And I'll hold you to sleep." He was behind her, holding her in his arms. Shine Group's cooperation dinner was held 4 days later, which was equivalent to the 5th day of the year according to the Chinese New Year. After all, it was a Chinese company, and it had many connections with many Chinese companies, so it was indeed very suitable to hold a dinner party on this day. In addition to the cooperation of various companies, such a dinner party was also held because of the New Year's atmosphere, so it was not too serious. There was a lot of food and drinks. Because Jin Wan was pregnant, she didn't wear a tight dress, but bought a loose doll dress suitable for the dinner party. She tried on a white chiffon dress. She originally wanted to wear high heels, but Mo Jingshan refused. She was not allowed to wear high heels because she was pregnant, so she had to change into a pair of flats. Tonight's banquet, Nan Hung was also present. Feng Ling was also present. She didn't wear a formal dress but still wore that cool black outfit. As soon as Jin Wan saw Feng Ling, she asked Mo Jingshan to greet the executives of those companies first, so that he wouldn't have to worry about whether she was suitable for the smell of alcohol and refuse others' toasts every time. "Mrs. Mo, why don't you go with CEO Mo?" Seeing Jin Wan suddenly come over, Feng Ling asked in confusion. "He's already introduced me to everyone, but it's really inconvenient for him to take care of me all the time. I said I wanted to come over to chat with you, so he let me come over." Jin Wan blinked at her and then glanced at Nan Heng. "Did you come with him?" Feng Ling's expression did not change. "He is the boss of the base and also my boss. He asked me to come, so I came." "Why are you in such a hurry to distance yourself?" "I didn't say anything." Jin Wan was about to take Feng Ling inside to find a place with fewer people to stay for a while when she suddenly caught a glimpse of Shuyen. Shuyen came with the Yin family and did not stand by Mo Xiao's side today. She also saw Jin Wan. When their eyes met, Shuyen smiled politely at Jin Wan, looked away and stepped on the red carpet to the VIP area inside with the Yin family. "You've been in the United States for so long. How much do you know about the companies and families that Shine Group often deals with?" Jin Wan picked up a glass of champagne and played with it in her hand, as if casually asking Feng Ling next to her. Feng Ling decisively took the glass from her hand, stuffed a glass of juice into her hand and answered, "The dozens of Chinese companies present today are all closely related to Shine Group, but there are also people like Miss In and Miss Su who are related to Mr. Mo, but most of them admire Mr. Mo. There are also many young ladies from aristocratic families who have been neglected by him many years ago. Miss Su is entangled with Mr. Mo only because she had a relationship with Mr. Mo a few years ago, and Miss In is the one that Mo Xiaoza sincerely wants to matchmake. As for the others, I basically can't remember their names." Jin Wan raised her eyebrows. Based on this situation, in fact, Mo Jingshan and Mo Xiaoza were both very principled people. At least one of them had a relationship with Mr. Mo, and the other was the daughter-in-law that Mo Xiaoza unilaterally wanted. As for the others, they were very common in the upper-class circle. Not to mention Mo Jingshan, even she had been pursued by many men in the upper-class circle in China, but at that time she was proud and arrogant and ignored everyone. She didn't have a complicated relationship with anyone, except for Sheng Yihan. However, she kept him at arm's length and didn't have the slightest ambiguous relationship with him. Thinking of this, Jin Wan felt more or less at ease. It was just the love between some young men and women in the circle. People couldn't control other people's love for them, not to mention that her husband was really outstanding. When Elder Su came with Su Jilan, many people present must have attended the engagement party of Su Jilan and Mo Jingshan. In an instant, many people looked at Su Jilan, and from time to time, some young ladies glanced meaningfully at Jin Wan. But what really attracted Jin Wan's attention was not these people, but the person who came with Su Jilan, Su Shui. After that soul-stirring farewell in T-City, Jin Wan had thought that she would never see Su Shui again in this life. Mo Jingshan looked at the door and looked away from Su Jilan and Su Shui. At the same time, Jin Wan felt the man's eyes on her. She turned around and saw that Mo Jingshan had come over. "Feng Ling, keep an eye on madam." Mo Jingshan suddenly took a look at Feng Ling as he took Jin Wan's hand. Feng Ling knew very well what the two young ladies of the Su family would do. The moment she saw Su Jilan and Su Shui, she instinctively raised her guard. She nodded. The red carpet in the banquet hall was in the middle, and there were many ways to go, but Su Jilan seemed to deliberately pass here. She pulled Su Shui, who looked panic-stricken, to this side. When they passed by Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan, many people around them looked at them gossiping, wondering if there would be any sparks between Mo Jingshan's ex-fiancée and his current wife. Being glanced at by so many people, Jin Wan forced herself to look away, ignoring their boring gazes, and only looked at Su Shui. Chapter 349. Especially when she suddenly saw Jin Wan, Su Shui seemed to be stimulated. She stared at her with red eyes, turned around and came straight to Jin Wan. Before Jin Wan could see what was going on with Su Shui, Mo Jingshan had quietly pulled her behind him, and his tall and straight figure stood in front of her. "Jin Wan? Why are you here?" Su Shui stared at Jin Wan as if she couldn't see anyone else. Su Shui was about to step forward, when Mo Jingshan's low, cold voice rang. "Elder Su, what do you mean? Since Shui was frightened last time, she has been locked up at home. Isn't it the spring festival? We can't let the child stay in her room all day. Jilan has the best relationship with her, so she took Shui here to relax while it's busy here. Shui's mental illness also needs to be exercised in crowded places. Maybe it will get better," Elder Su said with a smile. Mental illness? Jin Wan didn't expect Su Shui's current state to be a sign of mental illness, but Su Shui could call out her name just now. Could it be that Mo Jingshan or Nan Heng did something to Su Shui after that incident? Revenge must exist, but what kind of fright and revenge did she suffer to become like this? Su Shui had lost at least 10 pounds and her face was pale. She looked frightened and couldn't be provoked at all. She didn't look like she was pretending at all. Obviously she was really ill. Jin Wan didn't step forward. She just stood over Mo Jingshan's shoulder and looked thoughtfully at Su Shui, whose eyes were getting redder and redder as she stared at her. "All right, Shui, Miss Ji is also here to attend the party. It's all over. She won't do anything to you anymore. Don't be afraid." Su Jilan took Su Shui's hand and coaxed her in a gentle voice, like a good sister who doted on her cousin very much. But in an instant the people around were a little surprised. No one knew how Su Shui became like this, but it seemed that it was all because of Jin Wan that Su Shui became so pitiful. Su Shui was afraid of Jin Wan? Putting aside how powerful the Su family's background was, Su Shui was the young lady of the Swan group. Of the Su family's daughters, one was robbed of her man, and the other was so frightened that she developed a mental illness. And it was all because of Jin Wan? For a moment, the people around them looked at Jin Wan with a strange look in their eyes. Jin Wan glanced expressionlessly at Su Jilan, who was pulling Su Shui into the crowd. She really didn't expect that she would bring Su Shui to such a place. What was the point of beating around the bush? Mo Jingshan's hand tightened as if to comfort her. Nguan Xian said, Jilan, Jilan Xuan and Xuan, Su and Yen Mo Su Sun Wan Ji Su Shen Shui Jin Wan Ji Su Jin Wan. Mo Nguan Su Ji Shen Ji, Su Nguan Ji and Shui Ji, Shen Su Ji Jingshan. Mo Jingshan tightened his grip on her hand and looked back at her. "Let's leave early for the party tonight. We won't stay here for long in?" Jin Wan nodded subconsciously. Feng Ling, who was standing by her side, said in a low voice that only she and Mo Jingshan could hear, "Su Shui planned the kidnapping of you in T-City. She used to have connections with the underworld forces behind the Su family, so she was very bold and dared to cooperate with that kind of underground bar. After she was forcibly sent back to the United States, Nanheng sent Kei to teach her a lesson, and then she became like this." Jin Wan turned to meet Mo Jingshan's eyes and then to Feng Ling. "What did Kei do to Su Shui?" "They just copied what she did at that time. They drugged her, kidnapped her, beat her, threatened her, and sold her to an underground bar in the United States. She was bought by 3 tall and strong black men and was tortured by them for several days. When the Su family begged the police to save her, Su Shui was almost at her last breath. That terrible scene appeared in Jin Wan's mind again. If Mo Jingshan hadn't come in time, she might have been killed. What would have happened? Would she have been raped and then committed suicide, or would she have been sold to countless people because she didn't even have the strength to commit suicide? Su Shui suffered such a fate because of herself. Since Kay and the others only copied what she did, she could only blame herself. However, after being frightened and being tortured by the 3 black men for a few days, it was not surprising that Su Shui had become this absent-minded and emaciated appearance. The Su family had gone far away. Mo Jingshan held Jin Wan's hand and put her by his side, not leaving. When the banquet was at its climax, there was a burst of laughter and applause. It seemed that Mo Shaoza was drinking and talking with several partners. Jin Wan saw many people around her were applauding, so she also raised her hand and clapped. She looked around the crowd but didn't see Su Shui and Su Jilan. Perhaps Su Shui's condition was too bad, and Su Jilan had succeeded in tricking Jin Wan with Su Shui's excuse, so she had taken Su Shui away? Everyone raised their glasses and drank together. Jin Wan didn't drink tonight because she was pregnant, but Mo Jingshan just smiled and held her hand calmly. This man was really good-looking, especially when he smiled. The banquet went well. In the second half of the banquet, Jin Wan touched her belly. She had to go to the bathroom frequently during her pregnancy. She said, "Jingshan, I'm going to the bathroom." At this time, a partner was talking with Mo Jingshan, and it was not convenient for Mo Jingshan to go to the ladies' room. He patted her hand and motioned for her to go to Feng Ling. "Let Feng Ling accompany you." Okay. Jin Wan turned and went to Feng Ling. When she was about to go over, she suddenly saw that Nan Heng was pushing Feng Ling into a corner of the banquet hall. In the darkness of the corner, there seemed to be something ambiguous. Jin Wan? It didn't seem appropriate to go there. She glanced over there and then at the bathroom just a few steps behind her. On the other side, Feng Ling had just come out of the shackles of Nan Heng. She looked at the banquet hall expressionlessly, only to find that Jin Wan, who had been following Mo Jingshan, was gone. Chapter 350. Just as Feng Ling was feeling suspicious, suddenly, a scream came from the bathroom not far away. Ah! The scream didn't sound like Jin Wan, but it was drowned out by the bustling banquet hall. Only Feng Ling, who had just walked nearby, could hear it clearly. Feng Ling walked quickly to the women's bathroom and was about to push it open, only to find that the door was locked from the inside. "Mrs. Mo? Are you in there?" Feng Ling frowned warily, pressed against the door and asked in a low voice. It was quiet inside and no one answered. Even the person who screamed just now was silent. Feng Ling suddenly raised her foot and kicked the door hard. The loud crash startled everyone in the banquet hall. As the lock of the bathroom door was kicked down, Feng Ling quickly pushed the door open and searched inside with her sharp eyes, but there was no one in the bathroom. The scream just now was not Jin Wan, but the things scattered on the floor of the bathroom were Jin Wan's. A sharp pain came from her neck. Jin Wan frowned and slowly opened her eyes in a daze. The first thing she saw was Su Shui holding a fruit knife with a crazed look in her eyes, pressing the sharp side of the knife against her neck. The pain and coldness on her neck gradually woke Jin Wan up. She was about to shrink back when Su Shui moved the knife back with her. "What are you doing?" Jin Wan's head hurt. For a moment she couldn't remember how she was drugged, but Su Shui's eyes looked crazy. Her hair stood on end because of the other party's eyes. "Jin Wan, you finally fell into my hands." Su Shui widened her eyes and stared at the faint trace of blood on Jin Wan's white neck. As if stimulated by something more bloodthirsty, she smiled grimly and pressed the fruit knife harder against her carotid artery. "You ruined me. I'm going to kill you. Jin Wan. I'm going to kill you." Jin Wan felt that she was still under the effects of the drug and did not have much strength. However, she saw that Su Shui's hand that was holding the knife was trembling. She slowly raised her hand tentatively. While Su Shui was focused on pressing the knife into her neck, she abruptly raised her hand and used all her strength to hold onto her wrist. She then used some strength to force her wrist open and took the opportunity to snatch the knife away. Su Shui watched the opportunity to kill her disappear. She froze for a moment, looked at her empty hands, glared at Jin Wan coldly, and raised her hands to strangle her neck. "Jin Wan, I want you to die. Su Shui, wake up." Jin Wan avoided her hand and raised her arm to push her away. She turned to look at the scene outside the window and her eyelids twitched. What was going on? Why were they in the car? Outside the car window it looked like a highway. Both sides of the road were barren and there was nothing. Suddenly being shouted at by Jin Wan, Su Shui stared at her, trembling all over. Do you think you can still hurt me? Jin Wan, even if you want to kill me, I'll die with you. I'll kill you first. Hearing this, Jin Wan suddenly turned to look at Su Shui's crazy eyes. You didn't drug me? Su Shui acted as if she had heard a joke. You're still pretending? You relied on your ability to pretend to be innocent to make Mo Jingshan fall for you, didn't you? It was you who drugged me. Fortunately, I woke up early. Fortunately, I put a knife in my bag before I went to the party. I can take your life anytime, anywhere. Not Su Shui, they were both drugged at the same time? Su Shui said and was about to pounce on her again. Jin Wan frowned and waved her away. Calm down first. While holding Su Shui's wrist, she looked up at the car. It was a new BMW speeding on the highway. She and Su Shui were in the back of the car, and there was a glass or thick plastic partition between them and the driver's seat in front of the car, so they couldn't see who was driving. Judging from the scene outside the window, the speed of the car was at least more than 150 miles per hour. Why were they drugged and brought into this car at the same time? Jin Wan raised her hand and pressed her forehead. She remembered that when she went to the bathroom she happened to see Su Shui in there. At that time, Su Shui was standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom and applying lipstick. She looked at Jin Wan through the mirror as if there was an abyss in her eyes that was about to swallow Jin Wan. Her eyes were very strange, revealing the same madness and hatred as now. Jin Wan only took 2 steps in and subconsciously wanted to retreat. She didn't want to be in the same place with such a mentally unstable person. However, before she went out, 2 women suddenly ran in behind her who were eager to go to the bathroom. She didn't see them clearly, but she did want to go to the bathroom at that time, and there was only one bathroom on that floor. Seeing that she and Su Shui were not alone here, Jin Wan avoided Su Shui and went to the door a little farther on the other side. When she came out of the cubicle in the bathroom, Su Shui had disappeared. Then Jin Wan went to wash her hands. As soon as she put her hands under the water, she suddenly heard a scream from the soundproof door nearest her. The voice sounded very much like Su Shui's. She shivered all over and instinctively turned to walk out. At that moment, the cubicle door behind her was opened with a bang and someone rushed out. Before Jin Wan could get out of the bathroom, she was dragged back, and the door of the bathroom was locked by the 2 strong women. A wet cloth covered Jin Wan's mouth and nose, and the pungent smell made her more and more dazed until she lost consciousness. Everything happened in just 2 or 3 seconds and she couldn't react at all. But she never expected that she and Su Shui would be drugged and taken away at the same time. Listen. Now is not the time to be crazy. Jin Wan looked out of the window at the highway and the deserted hills and rivers on both sides of the road, and said solemnly, We may have been kidnapped at the same time. Who asked you to go to the party? Did Su Jilan invite you to go to the party with her, or did you unilaterally take the initiative to go with her? Su Shui stared at Jin Wan. Are you trying to drive a wedge between me and my cousin? Chapter 351. Seeing Jin Wan's cold and serious eyes, Su Shui was more or less shaken. Her slightly pale lips trembled before she reluctantly said, Seeing that I've been locked up by my family for too long, my cousin's heart aches for me. She said she would take me out to relax. With that, she suddenly glared at Jin Wan. Don't try to sow discord between us. I'm very close to my cousin. Even if there was a kidnapping, it would have nothing to do with her. She was stupid. She didn't know that she had been used once and now she was being used a second time. She didn't know how powerful her cousin was. If they really had a good relationship, Su Jilan would have stopped Su Shui from going to T-City to court her death from the very beginning. If it weren't for Su Jilan's pitiful and instigation, Su Shui, who was impulsive, wouldn't have been bold enough to run into Mo Jingshan's gun. And today, if Su Jilan didn't have a purpose, she wouldn't have taken Su Shui, who was so crazy, to the party. There was no way she could reason with a lunatic like this. Being driven at such a terrifying speed, Jin Wan felt nauseous again. She didn't know if the drug had stimulated her, but from the moment she woke up, a certain part of her stomach had been throbbing in pain. Jin Wan suppressed the panicky feeling of weightlessness, waved away Su Shui's hand that was about to pinch her shoulder, and patted the partition between her and the driver's seat. It was a layer of black glass and plastic which should not be particularly strong. Jin Wan patted it again, then looked down at the flat shoes on her feet, and then at the high heels on Su Shui's feet. She decisively bent down and took off her shoes. What are you doing? Su Shui's eyes were instantly filled with vigilance because of Jin Wan's strange action. Jin Wan ignored her, raised the strong heel of her shoe, and smashed it hard on the partition in front of her. Now the car was driving at such a terrible speed, and there were cars of all sizes on both sides from time to time, and she found that the car had been driving in a straight line. She had to find a way to stop the car. The heavy thud startled Su Shui and made her shrink aside. For a moment she didn't know what to do with Jinwan's neck. Jinwan knew that for a person like Su Shui who was stimulated and a little crazy, such noise would affect her mood, so she just silently banged on the partition and didn't ask her any more questions. Now was not the time to bicker. The two of them were in the same boat. If something happened, both of them would either die or be injured. Jinwan smashed the partition hard several times, and a crack finally appeared in the middle. Jinwan's hand was a little numb, so she continued to smash it with the other hand. When a huge hole was smashed in the middle of the partition, Jinwan did not feel any joy or relief, but her heart sank in an instant. There was no one in front of the car. The car was actually driverless. From the time they were thrown into the car to the time they woke up, at least 10 minutes had passed. The car had been driving at a speed of 150 miles per hour. It was common to see a highway without any detours in the United States, but it was definitely not that simple to maintain the speed of the car with the two of them in it. Now, do you still believe in your cousin? Jinwan stared at the empty driver's seat and asked in a low voice. Su Shui looked shocked and didn't understand. What did the driverless car have to do with her relationship with Su Jilan? Someone wants to use you to get rid of me, but they don't intend to let you live at all. Su Shui, you're really poor. You've done a lot of things for your cousin since you were a child, but in the end, it must be you who bear the responsibility, and your good sister, who is always protected by you, has always been like a cold blue lotus, untainted by the mud, hasn't she? Jinwan gave her a sarcastic look. Su Shui sat stiffly in the back as if she hadn't understood Jinwan's words. He was stupid enough to begin with. Now that he had gone crazy, it was even more incomprehensible. Jinwan withdrew her gaze from her and quickly smashed the hole in front of her with the heel of her shoe until most of the partition was smashed down. Then she crawled forward to the driver's seat and raised her hand to control the steering wheel, only to find that not only was the car's speed fixed, but even the steering wheel was locked. She couldn't control the direction at all, let alone brake. Both the brakes and clutch were loose and completely useless. Jinwan lowered her head and looked down, only to find that the car had been modified. Several places under the seat had clearly been tampered with. She saw several thick red, yellow, blue and green lines crisscrossing under the seat, and for a moment she felt a chill down her spine. Could it be that this car was installed with a self-ignition system? Noticing Jinwan's pale face, Su Shui immediately trembled and leaned on the seat behind her. Can you stop the car? Jinwan glanced at her silently. Rather than saying that Su Jilan was manic, it was better to say that Su Jilan was a person who would do anything to achieve her goals. Her cousin, who was always considerate of her, was used by her to such an extent. Now, in order to get rid of her, she was even willing to sacrifice Su Shui's life. If they really died in this car, no one would consider whether Su Jilan was the culprit. Because everyone knew that Su Shui and Jinwan had a grudge, and they also knew that Su Shui hated Jinwan. They also knew that Su Shui was crazy, and a lunatic could do anything terrible. So, such a crazy and terrible act of mutual destruction could only be done by Su Shui, who was already crazy. By then, Su Shui would be dead and there would be no evidence. While successfully eradicating her rival in love, she could also be cleared of suspicion. Feng Ling had said that Su Jilan was not simple. Sure enough, she was not simple. Jinwan glanced at the wires hidden under the car. Her and Su Shui's bags were gone, and there were no scissors or other tools at hand. It was impossible for high-heeled shoes to break such thick wires, and it was impossible for her hands to break them. The wires were not so long that they couldn't be pulled up and broken. Jinwan raised her hand and moved the steering wheel a few more times, but there was nothing she could move. She looked at the car again, which had been set at 150 miles per hour, and then looked out the window at the scenery of the road that kept moving backward at a terrifying speed. From time to time, cars flew past or were overtaken by the car. Even if there was no end to this straight highway, even if the car could slowly stop when the fuel ran out, if the car was really installed with a self-ignition system, it could explode at any time. Maybe in a minute, maybe in half an hour, unknown danger could happen at any time. Should she jump out of the car? Jump out of the car at 150 miles per hour? Chapter 352. Jinwan covered her aching belly with her hand, and her eyes gradually turned red. If she jumped like this, even if she didn't die, she would be hurt, not to mention she was pregnant. The other party really gave her a big problem. Jinwan, why are you sitting here? Stop the car. Why don't you stop the car? Several cars passed by at a strange speed, making people panic. Su Shui screamed from behind, "Are you trying to kill me? Stop the car. Get out of the car if you want to live. This car can't be stopped." Jinwan didn't bother to explain too much to her. She raised her hand and tried the car doors. As expected, they were all locked. Fortunately, the car was on land and not under water pressure. If there was no water pressure, she could use a sharp object to break the car window. Jinwan knocked Su Shui's high-heeled shoes on the car window several times. Her arms, which had been a little numb, were almost powerless now. She changed her hands to knock on the car window. In the end, she put on the high-heeled shoes that were a size larger than her feet, turned sideways on the seat, and kicked the car window hard with her foot. "What are you doing?" Su Shui looked at her strange actions blankly. "Don't talk so much nonsense." Jinwan kicked the car window and turned to look at her. "If you want to live, come and help me open the car window." Su Shui shrank her neck. She didn't believe Jinwan at all. The banging sound in the car made her even more panicked. Suddenly, she saw the fruit knife abandoned on the ground, picked it up, and pointed it at Jinwan again. "If you don't stop the car quickly, I'll kill you now." Jinwan glanced at her coldly and grabbed the fruit knife. Ignoring Su Shui's increasingly panicked and crazed eyes, she got up, put the fruit knife in the gap between the car window and the car door, and then smashed it with her high heels. Su Shui's eyes were cold. The car window was too strong. No wonder the other party had specially bought a new car to set up such a big conspiracy. All the windows of the new car basically had a smash-proof function. Jinwan gritted her teeth and pulled out the metal bar on the passenger seat to knock on the window as she and Mo Jingshan had done when they had escaped underwater. The car window was damaged one after another, and finally there was a gap. Jinwan slashed it again, cut open the seal with a fruit knife, and smashed it with her shoe until the whole car window was broken and fell down. Jinwan lay on the car window and observed the wasteland on both sides of the highway. Ahead of her was a sunken hill. There was no water and it was barren. She didn't know where it was. At a speed of 150 miles per hour, the moment the car window was opened, a gust of wind rushed in. Jinwan narrowed her eyes and looked around. Suddenly she turned and said, "Su Shui, come here." Su Shui's face was filled with fear as the strong wind blew in, and she shook her head vigorously. Jinwan lost her patience and reached out to tug at her. "Your cousin wants to harm you. Are you really going to let her have her way? Although we might get hurt, we have to jump to survive." "Jump? I don't want it. I'll definitely die if I jump at this speed. You really want to harm me?" Su Shui screamed and pushed her. Jinwan tugged her hard. Since she couldn't reason with her, she had to use force. Just as the two of them were fighting, Jinwan suddenly seemed to hear the sound of a siren. She turned her head abruptly and looked at the wires under the seat. The siren sounded frightening. She tightened her grip and pulled Su Shui to the open window. "Jump." "I don't want to jump." The two of them kept fighting, and Jinwan couldn't divert her attention to the huge truck that had been following this car. Su Shui was almost pushed out by Jinwan again and again. She didn't know where the brute force came from, but she suddenly grabbed Jinwan's neck and forced Jinwan to let go of her. Then she turned over and pressed Jinwan hard against the car door. Her eyes were red as she strangled Jinwan's neck and shouted, "If you want to die, die by yourself. Don't drag me. Go to hell you." Jinwan was shocked to see the hatred in Su Shui's eyes. She wanted to wake her up, but her face was red and she couldn't speak. Just as she was about to be pushed out of the car window by Su Shui, half of Jinwan's body was exposed outside the window. Out of the corner of her eye, she finally saw the huge truck that had been following closely behind, and at the same time she saw the black Bentley speeding up behind it. Bentley? A black Bentley? At this angle and speed, she couldn't see the license plate clearly, but the model of the car was so familiar to her that she frowned hard. Just as she was distracted, Su Shui pushed her out with force. Jinwan's back brushed against the remaining glass fragments of the car window. The pain made her lose the strength to resist. The moment she was pushed out, with the inertia of the speeding car and the speed at which she was thrown, she felt as if she was flying for 2 seconds and then fell heavily to the ground. At the moment of falling, Jinwan subconsciously covered her stomach with her hand, but her body rolled several times on the ground. Her limbs and bones were in so much pain that she almost lost consciousness. Almost at the same time, the huge truck rushed straight in her direction and even sped up. Hearing the sound, Jinwan raised her head with a jerk and looked at the huge truck that was about to rush towards her. The truck was coming straight for her. Even the escape route of jumping out of the car had been blocked? She didn't even have the last chance of survival? Despair and panic swamped her in an instant, At this critical moment, the black Bentley several meters behind the huge truck suddenly sped up. At the moment when Jean Wan was about to be run over by the truck, the black Bentley rushed into her sight at an astonishing speed and decisively stood between her and the truck. Boom, there was a loud bang. In a trance, Jean Wan seemed to see the license plate number of the black Bentley rushing over, and a string in her brain snapped with the loud crash. Don't! Jean Wan's body was thrown to the side of the road by the impact of the two cars in front of her. After rolling several times, she couldn't control her body and hit hard against the safety fence on the side of the highway. She felt as if her abdomen was being torn apart, and waves of pain assaulted her. The cars in the rear slammed on the brakes one after another because of the terrible accident in front of them. With a series of breaking sounds, the world seemed to fall silent for an instant. Jean Wan raised her eyes with some difficulty and looked at the black Bentley that was almost hit by the huge truck. Chapter 353. Jean Wan's entire body trembled in pain. Her heart felt empty. She stared at the car, her hands struggling to crawl on the ground, but no matter how hard she tried, she could not move. The sharp, throbbing pain in her abdomen stimulated her nerves. Jingshan. In the distance there was a loud explosion. There was no need to guess to know that the car Su Shui was in had self-ignited and exploded. The fire and thick black smoke covered the sky with a layer of fog. The highway was suddenly quiet and suffocating, and the smell of death slowly penetrated Jean Wan's skin. Her tense and disordered nerves cooled down bit by bit, but she felt cold and bone-chilling. Jean Wan had never felt the sky was so gloomy. The black Bentley stopped there motionlessly, and the gasoline under the car sprang up a small fire. Jean Wan stared at the fire, gritted her teeth, and tried desperately to crawl over to put out the fire, but after a long time she only moved a few centimeters forward. Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling's voice followed. A lot of drivers had gathered behind the giant truck. She quickly pushed the crowd away and ran in. When she saw Jean Wan lying on the ground with red eyes, she rushed over. Feng Ling crouched down to help Jean Wan up, but Jean Wan kept staring at the black Bentley and said hoarsely, "Who is the person in the car? Let me help you up first." Feng Ling almost never cried. Now seeing Jean Wan's blank eyes and the blood oozing from her lower body, her eyes almost turned red. She stepped forward and tried to help her up, but Jean Wan couldn't even stand steadily and just kept staring at the car. "Tell me, who is the person in the car?" Feng Ling gritted her teeth and didn't speak. Jean Wan slowly turned her eyes to Feng Ling. "Is it Mo Jingshan?" Feng Ling grabbed her arm to prevent her from falling, but her hand holding her arm trembled slightly. She tried to comfort her, but she couldn't suppress her emotions at all. She lowered her eyes and whispered, "Mr. Mo, and we have tracked your location and chased you all the way. We were half an hour behind you and finally caught up with you as fast as we could, but just now, when we saw you being pushed out of the car window, Mr. Mo's car suddenly accelerated to the limit." Jean Wan's mind went blank for a moment. The person in the car was Mo Jingshan. The moment her consciousness stopped, Jean Wan suddenly pushed Feng Ling away, turned around and staggered in the direction of the car. Feng Ling didn't expect that she still had the strength to push herself away and stepped back. When she reached out to help her, Jean Wan had already rushed to the side of the black Bentley. She rushed forward to hold Jean Wan, who almost knelt on the ground, and held her arm tightly. "Mrs. Mo, don't do this." Jean Wan stared at the motionless Bentley in front of her and couldn't hear anything. Nanheng, who rushed into the crowd almost at the same time as Feng Ling, didn't say a word and directly asked Kay and the others to catch the driver of the giant truck. At the same time, a group of people were solemnly preparing to rescue him. The drivers around. And they pointed. "And, did the car in front explode? Did you? Is it too scary?" "Look, the car and Emoji said. "Shin. And she. Have a handshake I to say. To say, and. The car is leaking oil. Look, the oil is on fire. Will this car explode too?" The whispers of the crowd couldn't reach Jean Wan's ears. She held back her tears and stared at the broken window with bloodshot eyes. She tried to push Feng Ling away, but Feng Ling still held her arm tightly and finally hugged Jean Wan with both hands. "Mrs. Mo, don't be impulsive. Let me go. Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling, let me go." Jean Wan screamed. "Let me go. This car may spontaneously combust at any time. Mr. Mo risked his life to rush here and block the way just to save your life. No matter what happens to Mr. Mo, if you don't leave now, won't Mr. Mo's sacrifice be in vain?" "Sacrifice what? How could he be sacrificed?" "He won't." Jean Wan struggled crazily in her arms and finally couldn't move. Hearing the sound of Nan Heng and Feng Ling trying to open the door, she couldn't hold back her tears and knelt to the ground powerlessly. Jinwan. Feng Ling couldn't help calling her name. She lowered her head and saw Jinwan's trembling and twitching shoulders. She held her shoulders and said calmly, "Your lower body is covered with blood. Get in the car first." "Jinwan, don't be like this." Seeing the fire on the gasoline under the car getting bigger and bigger, Jinwan wanted to go up and put it out. Nan Heng suddenly looked at Jinwan and said seriously, "Feng Ling, take Jinwan away immediately." It was necessary to take Jinwan away. With Nan Heng's order, Feng Ling forced Jinwan up from the ground, put her arms around her shoulders and took her hand. "Let's go." Jinwan didn't speak or move. She just stared at the black Bentley and watched the blood spreading out along the door. She felt dizzy. "Mo Jingshan, come out, come out." Jinwan's mind was blank. She unconsciously walked to the car door but was held down by Feng Ling. She stared blankly at the deformed car door. The airbag of a Bentley is better than that of many cars. "He'll be fine, right?" Jinwan seemed to be talking to Feng Ling, but also seemed to be talking to the person in the car and more like talking to herself. Feng Ling didn't say anything. No matter how good the car was, it was driven at the limit of its speed. If it was an ordinary car at this speed, it would have been smashed into pieces in an instant. The huge impact was not something a normal person could bear. Besides, Mr. Mo drove the car horizontally, and the side of the car was hit. The defense of the side was not as strong as that of the front and back of the car, so the situation inside the car was obviously no better than outside. It could only be worse than what they saw. At the moment when Jinwan was almost crushed to death by the giant truck, Mr. Mo used his life to exchange for Jinwan's. Just now, when he suddenly drove the car to the limit, no one could see this scene. Even though Feng Ling had been through fire and water for so many years and was used to death, she still couldn't forget the scene just now. Feng Ling held Jinwan's hand, pulled her over and was about to take her away. In fact, Jinwan didn't have much strength, and the red and sticky lower body made her realize what she had lost at this moment. Why did this happen? Why did it suddenly become like this? Chapter 354. Feng Ling forcibly took Jinwan back to the black SUV not far behind. As soon as she opened the door, there was a sudden noise. It sounded like the deformed car door was finally opened. Hearing the noise, Jinwan froze, turned her eyes in that direction with a jerk and turned to walk back. "Jinwan, don't go over there. Mo Jingshan is there." "I heard them open the car door." Feng Ling held her and didn't let her move. In this situation, Mr. Mo was probably covered in blood. If Jinwan went over in this state, she would probably suffer a big blow. "Feng Ling, let me go over." "Jinwan. I beg you." Jinwan finally could not hold it in any longer. She choked with sobs and large drops of tears rolled down her battered and blood-stained face. She stared stubbornly in that direction. "Let me go see him. I want to go see him." Feng Ling made up her mind and pulled Jinwan back with force. Jinwan's whole body bumped into her arms. Feng Ling was about to help her into the car when Jinwan's whole body suddenly softened and she fell down. "Jinwan." Feng Ling was startled and rushed to hold her steady. Fearing that something really happened to her, she helped her into the car. When she looked down and saw the blood on Jinwan's lower body, she hurriedly took off her black coat and wrapped it around her lower body. Then she quickly contacted the nearest rescue team and emergency center. Feng Ling watched Jinwan being pushed out of the car. A normal person would be hurt after being pushed out of a car at such a speed, let alone Jinwan's stomach. Feng Ling didn't dare to think anymore. She held the phone in one hand and held Jinwan's hand tightly with the other, but only felt a bone-chilling coldness. Jinwan's blood seemed to be frozen. From her hands to her face to her neck, she was cold everywhere. She was still frowning in her coma and murmuring indistinctly. Listening carefully, she seemed to be calling Mo Jingshan's name. When Jinwan woke up, she thought she just had a nightmare, but as soon as she moved, she felt pain all over, as if all her bones and flesh had been taken apart and reassembled. For a moment, she almost suspected that her rebirth was fake. Perhaps she had just returned to the despair and pain 10 years later. She stared blankly at the snow-white walls and ceiling of the hospital. After a long time, she slowly turned her eyes to look around. Hospital again. But it was an intensive care unit. She felt as if there were 2 fixed tubes delivering oxygen to her nose. She felt as if there was something clamped on her fingers. There were several medical instruments around her, and from time to time, beeping sounds could be heard. Jinwan opened her eyes and closed them again. After a moment, she opened them again. The nightmare-like experience on the highway lingered in her mind. She wanted to treat it all as a nightmare, but the faint pain in her stomach and the drip on the back of her hand told her the cruelest truth. If the child was still there, the doctor would not have given her an injection. The ward was very quiet. Jinwan didn't move. She didn't have the strength to move. She silently digested all this, and her heart and abdomen seemed to ache at the same time. She had a dream just now. She dreamed that Mo Jingshan took her to the upper reaches of the Los Angeles River. She dreamed that Mo Nguyen Studio was officially listed in High City and became a joint stock real estate company. She dreamed that she and Mo Jingshan appeared together at the Domestic Business Managers Conference. She dreamed that they stood side by side and she was by his side, becoming the best version of herself. But when she opened her eyes, she found that she was surrounded by a cold and pale ward. There was no one around. This was a sterile ward. Only doctors in sterile clothes could enter. Jinwan lay quietly alone. Seeing the doctor come in and check her body by the bedside, he found that Jinwan had woken up. The doctor put his gloved hand on her forehead and said to her in English as if comforting her, "Miss Ji, although I know this may be cruel to you, we must apologize to tell you that the child was not saved. It was not easy for an adult to survive such a huge fall and impact. You have been unconscious here for 5 days and successfully passed the critical period. After 2 more days of observation, you can be transferred to a general ward." Jinwan looked at the doctor silently and blinked gently, indicating that she had heard him. The doctor had seen many women who went crazy or emotional after suffering a major accident, but Jinwan was very quiet and motionless. She slowly closed her eyes and was very calm. But she was so calm that it made his heart ache. The doctor always liked patients who were so cooperative. Seeing that she was too calm and quiet, he said to her patiently, "It was our best medical team who performed the surgery for you. Please rest assured that your fertility was not affected. After you recover, you can have another child. The 2-month-old child is just a small embryo. Don't be too sad. Your injury is really serious. Falling at that speed is equivalent to falling from at least 4 or 5 floors. You are lucky to be alive. You will continue to have everything in the future. Rest well and recover." Jinwan closed her eyes silently and nodded slowly and weakly. 2 days later, as the doctor said, Jinwan could be transferred from the ICU to a general ward. Jinwan was still sleeping when she was transferred to the ward. When she woke up, she was already lying on the bed. Feng Ling pushed the door open and saw that Jinwan was lying there motionless with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling of the ward. She walked in. "Madame Mo came just now, but you were still sleeping. She personally made chicken soup for you to nourish your body." With that, Feng Ling came over and opened a white thermos flask by the bed. The fragrance from it instantly wafted out. Jinwan had been unconscious for 5 days and had been in the ICU with an oxygen tube for 2 days. She hadn't spoken for a week. When she smelled the fragrance, her chapped lips moved. She wanted to speak, but her voice was too hoarse. "Where is Mo Jingshan?" Jinwan asked where Mo Jingshan was, not how he was now. If the answer was that he was still in the hospital, it meant that at least he was still alive. If the answer was, not in the hospital, Jinwan didn't dare to think further. She turned to look at Feng Ling, who was helping her to ladle the chicken soup. "Answer me." Feng Ling ladled the chicken soup out and gently stirred it in the bowl with a spoon to make the soup less hot. While stirring, she said, "The body and the interior of the car were seriously deformed. Mr. Mo's driver's seat was too narrow. When his head was hit, a steel bar in the car pierced Mr. Mo's cervical vertebra and spine, and another one directly penetrated his shoulder." Jinwan's hands on her sides instantly clenched and her body was cold. Chapter 355. Feng Ling came over and shook the head of Jinwan's bed, trying to feed her soup. Jinwan didn't open her mouth but looked silently at the door. After a long silence, she asked, "His cervical spine and spinal nerves were injured. Will he wake up?" Feng Ling tightened her grip on the spoon. Although Jinwan was not a medical student, she certainly knew the most basic human knowledge. The spine and cervical spine were both key parts of the brain. Even if Mr. Mo's vital organs were not injured, it was a miracle that he could survive such a serious car accident. But judging from the fact that he had been in a coma for 7 days and was still in danger, it was unknown whether he could wake up or not. The doctor had said that there was only a 30% chance that Mr. Mo could survive. If he couldn't hold on, the result of the treatment was likely to be a coma. But she couldn't tell Jinwan this at all. But now even if she didn't say it, Jinwan could guess it. Feng Ling was silent for a moment, sat by the bed and put the bowl to her mouth. "Mrs. Mo has been in the hospital these days. She made this soup and brought it to you. Drink some first." "Mrs. Mo?" Jinwan looked at the chicken soup in the bowl. Sure enough, Ms. Wanzhu's cooking skills were really good. She could smell the soup just like a chef. She couldn't imagine how Wanzhu felt when she endured the pain of losing her son and the pain of her daughter-in-law's miscarriage and insisted on making soup for her. Drink some. Mrs. Mo's pain and worry are no less than yours, but she is really strong. For Mr. Mo's sake, you have to hold on, especially you. Now you have to take good care of your body. And if you drink this soup, Mrs. Mo will feel better. Jinwan obediently took a sip. It was indeed delicious. It was light but not tasteless. How long will it take for him to pass the critical period? After a few sips, Jinwan couldn't drink anymore and asked hoarsely. Knowing that she couldn't drink now, Feng Ling put the bowl aside and answered, I don't know. He still needs to be observed and treated. Dr. Qin has rushed here after receiving the news. Don't worry about the medical environment in the United States. As long as there is a glimmer of hope, they will use the best medicine and medical means to save Mr. Mo. Since Feng Ling had said so, even if Jinwan's heart was falling apart, she could only keep calm on the surface. They didn't want her to be too sad. It was unnecessary for her to be sad now. The only thing she could do was not to let them worry about her. After another week, Mo Jingshan was still in a coma. There were even a few times when he was critically ill but was saved in an emergency. During this period, Jinwan couldn't sleep well every night. As long as she closed her eyes, she would see the scene of the black Bentley rushing over in front of her. The loud crash and the soaring shock woke her up again and again, and then she couldn't sleep anymore. These days, the news she learned from Feng Ling was that Su Shui died in the car with the spontaneous combustion system. When the Los Angeles police came to investigate, they did presume that Su Shui had some grudges with Jinwan, and because of her emotional instability she wanted to die with Jinwan, but in the end she died in the exploding car. When the police went to the Su family to collect evidence, Elders Su and Su Jilan didn't say much. Only Su Jilan told the media that Su Shui was her closest cousin, and she didn't expect her to be so crazy that she would go to such extremes as dying with others. One by one, the responsibility was piled on Su Shui. Dead men tell no tales. Although this case was not closed hastily, the police had basically confirmed this situation, so they did not continue to search for the truth so seriously. Even if Jinwan wanted to confront Su Jilan now, she couldn't go out of the hospital, and Mo Jingshan hadn't woken up. She didn't have the energy to identify or accuse Su Shui. After all, she didn't have any evidence. Su Jilan really made use of Su Shui. Everything was so natural that even the police with a keen sense of smell didn't notice anything wrong. But Jinwan wouldn't let go of the murderer who caused her miscarriage. Time passed day by day. Jinwan couldn't get up at first, but a few days later she could walk around the ward, and half a month later she could occasionally go to Mo Jingshan's ICU and stare blankly. There was no glass in this ward, so she couldn't see what was going on inside or the people inside. She could only feel the man a few meters away from her through the wall, but somehow she felt he was so far away. Every day the first thing Jinwan asked when she woke up, "Is Mo Jingshan awake?" The answer she got was a shake of the head. Jinwan couldn't imagine that he had been in a coma for nearly 20 days, but from the doctor's occasional conversations, she could tell that the worst result was that he would sleep forever. The winter nights in Los Angeles were really cold. Standing outside Mo Jingshan's ward, Jinwan raised her hand and touched the cold wall. The light in the wall had been out for a long time, but she still refused to leave. She just wanted to stay here with him, waiting for him to wake up and open his eyes. After being separated by the wall for so many days, Jinwan recalled her relationship with Mo Jingshan in her previous life. It was so simple for a person to disappear from life. Mo Jingshan disappeared so completely in those 10 years, just like now, silently and without a trace. Fate seemed to play a big joke on Jinwan. She thought she had found back everything she had lost in her previous life, but now it seemed to be pulling away bit by bit. In her previous life, Mo Jingshan could return to China safely after 10 years. How could he stay in a coma now? 2 days later, Jinwan squatted alone outside Mo Jingshan's ward in the middle of the night. She looked out of the window at the moonless night sky and waited for him to wake up longer and longer. When Jinwan was well enough to be discharged from the hospital, it had been a month since the car accident. Mo Jingshan had been in a coma for a month. 3 days ago, the doctor said that he had passed the critical period and his life had stabilized, but when would he wake up? Maybe tomorrow or maybe never. Jinwan wanted to stay with him in the hospital, but Wanzhu forced her to go back to the Mo family in Los Angeles. With Jinwan here, Wanzhu felt that Mo Jingshan was also here. Seeing Jinwan, she felt at ease and didn't want Jinwan to be in a daze every day and night in the cold hospital. Lying in the bedroom where Mo Jingshan used to sleep, Jinwan called him 3 times a day even though she knew his cell phone wasn't answered. Every time his cell phone was turned off. Jinwan followed Wanzhou to the hospital again, but she still couldn't enter the ward at will. She hadn't seen him for a month. Jinwan squatted in the corridor holding her cell phone and texting Mo Jingshan. She only sent one sentence. Mo Jingshan, I'm scared. Chapter 356. The police had closed the case of Su Shui's death in the car. On the day the case was closed, the head of the police came to the hospital. Mo Xiaozi took the photos taken at the crime scene and saw the photos of Mo Jingshan's smashed black Bentley. He negotiated with the police about these photos and asked the truck driver's confession. Jinwan walked past them, heard what they said, saw the stack of photos in Mo Xiaozi's hand, and saw the black smoke spreading from Su Shui's car after the fire was extinguished. She suddenly turned to look at Feng Ling who had been following her. Come with me to the Su family. The Su family? Su Shui's home. Su Shui's parents were in charge of the Swan Group in Los Angeles, which was not to be underestimated. However, Su Shui's parents were obviously just honest businessmen and had never participated in the affairs of Elder Su and the Su family. When Jinwan arrived at the Su family, Su Shui's parents almost rushed up to strangle her when they saw her, saying that she killed their daughter. Feng Ling stopped Su Shui's parents expressionlessly, and with Feng Ling's cooperation, Jinwan entered the Su family unimpeded. Tc. Our Shui has been killed because of you. What are you doing here? Get out of here. We don't welcome you here. Jinwan entered the door and heard the roar of Su Shui's parents. She stopped and looked back at them coldly. If you had been a little wary of the people closest to you, Su Shui wouldn't have ended up like this. She was killed because of me? Did she really die because of me? Su Shui's mother had been crying for a month and stared at her with swollen eyes and pale face. Su Shui's father, who was still rational, pointed at Jinwan and scolded, Our Shui was tortured to madness because of you. She barely survived, but in the end she died because of you. How dare you say she didn't die because of you? Jinwan turned around and no longer looked at them, and the faint trace of mockery in her eyes did not fall into their eyes. She just said lightly, I almost died in the hands of your daughter twice. Maybe I am indeed more fortunate than her. At least I don't have a sister who seems to be close to me but actually wants to use me to harm me. Jinwan suddenly paused. Why not? Wasn't her previous life ruined in the hands of her good sister, Ji Menggran? Therefore, the scariest thing in the world is never the enemy standing in the open, but the so-called closest person who plays with you every day and seems to be on the same side as you, but is always trying to push you into the abyss. What do you mean? What did Shui's death have to do with Jilan? We all know that Jilan and Shui grew up together. Don't think that just because Shui is dead, there's no evidence. Now you're still trying to point the finger at Jilan. You're still trying to sow discord at a time like this. Women are truly the most vicious. Father Su couldn't push Feng Ling away at all. After cursing for a long time, he could only be blocked by Feng Ling. Jinwan was expressionless. Based on Su Shui's suicidal behavior, the police concluded that she was the mastermind of the whole thing and hastily closed the case. As her parents, are you really willing to let your daughter bear the crime of attempted murder and self-immolation? Jinwan didn't look at them but spoke while observing everything in the Su family, her voice cold and indifferent. Father Su and Mother Su's expressions changed slightly and they stared at her. Where is the room where Su Shui used to live? Jinwan asked directly. Father Su hesitated and looked at Jinwan's back suspiciously. When he was about to speak, Mother Su grabbed his arm with a broken look and stopped him from speaking. You can't let her into our daughter's room. We can't let such a woman who killed Shui enter Shui's room. Jinwan abruptly turned her head, only to see Su Jingshan's mother's red eyes. For a moment, she thought of how Mo Jingshan's mother had not shed a single tear in front of her these days despite her depression. Jinwan paused and then said, Are you sure I killed Su Shui? Am I not one of the victims? Mother Su ignored her and looked away with red eyes. Father Su pointed to the second floor. Second floor, the room with the white door. Jinwan withdrew her gaze and turned to walk in. The Su family was not small. She walked up the stairs and circled around on the second floor before she found Su Shui's room. The servants of the Su family were surprised to see her, but no one dared to stop her. They just stood aside and looked strangely at the person who suddenly broke in. Jinwan walked into the bedroom that Su Shui used to live in. The room that was filled with the heart of a young girl had not changed even though its owner had passed away. It was as though someone had insisted on cleaning it every day for the past month. Even the KT cat pillow on the bed appeared as though it had just been washed and was neatly placed there. The room was filled with the smell of air freshener. Jinwan looked around, walked to the table in the room, and saw a delicate photo frame, in which the photo was a group photo of Su Shui and Su Jilan. She picked up the photo frame, turned it over, and opened it. When the photo fell out, she saw the words on the back, 200x taken in Japan. That was to say, Su Shui and Su Jilan had been to Japan a year ago, and Su Jilan was not locked up at home by Elder Su because of mania as people said. Relatively speaking, she was very free. On the table shelf were some simple items that were suitable for young girls. How could someone with the heart of a romantic young girl be so vicious and merciless as to run all the way to T-City to kidnap her? Jinwan opened the drawer under the table and asked the servant at the door, "Did Su Shui have any contact with anyone other than her cousin when she was alive?" The servant didn't know who Jinwan was and subconsciously answered, "Before she went crazy, she had a good interpersonal relationship with her friends and classmates, but when she suddenly dropped out of school and said she was going to study in China, she only kept in touch with Miss Su Jilan." At this time Jinwan's hand paused in the drawer. She looked at the bottles of medicine in it, picked them up, opened them, put them to her nose and sniffed them. Suddenly her eyes were cold and she covered the bottles again and held them in her palm. She continued to rummage through the other things in the drawer and asked, "Did Su Jilan also send these medicines?" Chapter 357. Really? Jinwan held the bottle of medicine in her palm. If it were any other medicine she might not have recognized it so quickly, but at this time she didn't know whether it was fate or fate. She had taken this kind of medicine. It was the same medicine that Ji Mengran had taken to stimulate her emotions and cause her mental disorder. How could this be a medicine that could calm her down? This kind of medicine would only make Su Shui, who was already crazy, more emotionally unstable, and more unable to withstand any stimulation. What was mania? Everyone knew that Su Jilan had this kind of illness, but they didn't know that she had driven her cousin crazy. Jinwan went to check Su Shui's wardrobe and the drawers and tables in several other rooms. She tried to just check and look through them and put them back neatly before closing the door. She had to respect the dead. Even if she didn't like Su Shui, she still had to behave herself. The result of the examination proved that Su Jilan did give Su Shui this kind of medicine that could cause mental disorder. The original cause of madness was neurasthenia. This kind of medicine would aggravate Su Shui's illness, and if the doctor didn't give Su Shui a blood test, he couldn't guess the cause or find out the cause. Jinwan called Kei and asked him to go to the police station to get Su Shui's autopsy report. Even if Su Shui was blown to pieces, the autopsy report must have been done by the forensic doctor. In the afternoon, Jinwan had stayed at the Su family for several hours, and Father Su and Mother Su had gradually calmed down and sat on the sofa opposite her. Trying to be as calm as possible, Jinwan had a rough idea of what had happened after hearing some things from Father Su and Mother Su. "I've asked you so many questions but I haven't said a word about Su Jilan. You can continue to think that I wanted to drag Su Jilan down with me after Su Shui died, but if you calm down and think about it carefully, when Su Shui and I were kidnapped at the same time and woke up in that car, the driverless car was already on the highway. The worst result was that Su Shui and I died together. The dead can't testify. Who will benefit most if we both die?" Father Su frowned and didn't speak. They were businessmen and naturally knew the cause and effect of many things. These days they only focused on Jinwan and Su Shui, but ignored Su Jilan who had been caring for them. As for Su Shui's case, it was highly likely that Su Shui directed and acted on her own. The police investigated and collected evidence from various parties and found that it was indeed Su Shui who initiated it. When the police went to Elder Su and Su Jilan to investigate, they obtained the most useful testimony, which determined the outcome of the case. But if he really led this matter to Su Jilan's point of view, it didn't seem that simple. At this moment, Mother Su suddenly received a call. When she put down the phone, she looked at Jinwan and then at her husband by her side. She said in a low voice, "It's Jilan. She said she'll come to visit us in the afternoon and asked if we need to bring anything." Father Su's face was gloomy and he didn't say anything, but Jinwan asked with a faint smile, "After Su Shui died, did Su Jilan often come to see you?" "No, she just stayed by our side during the memorial service. Other times she would usually call us every 2 or 3 days to comfort us. She said that she would be our daughter in the future and that if we needed anything we should tell her." Mother Su was still sobbing a little. With red eyes she said, "Today was the first time she said she would come to our house. Looks like Miss Su knows I'm here." Jinwan smiled mildly as she glanced at them. "I won't see her. When she comes, tell her to look for me at the police station. I'll wait for her there. Su Chenxi's father suddenly frowned and said, although the things you asked just now do make sense when we think about them carefully, you can't wrongly accuse a good person. Jilan has been very good to our family. If you hurt Jilan just to clear your name or for your own interests, we won't allow it. Jinwan said expressionlessly, the case has been closed. I'm the victim from the beginning to the end, and the police didn't make things difficult for me. Why do I need to clear my name? Benefits? What are my benefits? My 2-month-old baby is gone. Do you think I have to sacrifice my husband's life and the baby's life just to make Su Jilan a suspect? Speaking of Mo Jingshan's current situation and Jinwan's miscarriage, Father Su and Mother Su fell silent. Jinwan was going to find out the real murderer behind the scenes and avenge her child and Mo Jingshan. Today she came here to sort out her emotions and thoughts. Now that she suddenly mentioned these things, she felt very depressed. She stood up and walked out without looking back. Jinwan went to the police station and handed over some of the evidence she had collected in the Su family to the police. At the same time, she gave a recording pen to the police. The content of the recording pen was from the moment she walked into the Su family to the moment she left. In the past few hours, the conversation with the servants, the conversation with Father Su and Mother Su, as well as some detailed details of the process. After all, Jinwan was Mo Jingshan's wife. She suddenly demanded a reversal of the case and a new investigation, so the police did not dare to neglect her. Su Jilan's biggest advantage was that no matter what happened, no one would suspect her, so she could avoid all the suspicions and get away successfully. But now, as long as all the suspicions were piled on her and the police kept investigating her, there would be results. Mo Jingshan hadn't woken up yet, so she couldn't get more favorable evidence from him. But now, as long as Su Jilan's suspicion was cleared, she wouldn't be able to continue to get away with it. In the evening, Su Jilan, who had been to the Su family, soon arrived at the police station. As soon as she entered the police station, she saw Jinwan, who had just come out of the police evidence room, and Feng Ling standing at the door. Su Jilan paused, then gave a faint smile and looked straight at Jinwan, who had raised her eyes to meet hers. You're here? Jinwan glanced at her flatly, without a smile or anger. Her eyes were as pale as a thick fog, but hidden in the fog was a killing intent that she had never had in her previous lives. Chapter 358. The real murderer hasn't been found and the case is closed. How can I be reconciled to it? Jinwan's words were indifferent and straightforward. Miss Su, I just casually said that I would come to the police station. If you want to see me, come to the police station to find me. I didn't expect you to come so soon. Didn't you go to the Su family to accompany Su Shui's parents? Seeing the coldness in Jinwan's eyes and the hidden meaning in her words, Su Jilan looked at her incredulously and then smiled casually. Miss Ji, didn't you say that you would wait for me at the police station? Is it more important to see Su Shui's parents or to come to the police station to see me? Jinwan was calm and collected. She did not even raise her eyelids. Her indifferent tone conveyed a clear coldness and disdain. I'm afraid you only went to the Su family to pay a visit before heading straight to the police station, right? Su Jilan slowly frowned and stared at Jinwan. What on earth do you want to say, Miss Ji? Don't you know what I want to say? Otherwise, why would you come to the police station in such a hurry? Jinwan's lips curved into a smile. I've already submitted the evidence to the police. I'll leave the rest to you, Miss Su. Su Jilan's smile gradually became unnatural. Why don't I understand what you mean? Didn't you ask me to come to the police station because Shui's case has been closed? Jinwan was not in the mood to deal with her. Her eyes were cold, but her lips were slightly smiling. Miss Su, you're so good at acting. I used to think that you were too simple, too emotional, and too impulsive, but obviously Su Shui was also deceived by your false appearance, so she wholeheartedly stood up for you. Su Jilan also smiled. I see why you asked me to come to the police station. Did you want to drag me down after Shui's death? I never expected that Miss Ji would be so cunning and ruthless. Shui's body is still warm. You should have stayed in the hospital to guard Jingshan. Why did you come out to torment our Su family? Jinwan's delicate and mild eyes were filled with faint mockery. You'd better leave these words to the police. For example, how are you going to explain that the drugs you gave Su Shui to treat her are actually drugs that will make her mentally and emotionally unstable? The smile in Su Jilan's eyes gradually faded. She looked at Jinwan and didn't speak, but her fingers suddenly tightened around the bag, betraying the shock in her heart. Are you surprised that I discovered something from this colorless and odorless medicine? Miss Su still has a lot to explain to the police. For example, before Su Shui went to T-City, you frequently drank with her and complained to her, and then gave her a lot of small gifts. After she was instigated by you to go to T-City, you closed the door to her when she came back. It wasn't until something happened to her and she became crazy that you began to play the role of a good cousin. You can also explain to the police that while Su Shui was crazy, you said that you were taking her out to relax, but in reality you were taking her to the cinema to watch horror movies, to the amusement park or to some haunted houses. You had no intention of improving her madness at all, and you didn't intend to comfort her. In addition, you can also explain to the police that Su Shui was resting at home with a cold that night, but you suddenly took the initiative to ask her to accompany you to the party. She didn't have anything like a fruit knife in her bag, but you asked her to bring a knife to protect herself because she was afraid of people. The dress she wore at that time was chosen by you at the last minute, wasn't it? She should wear size S, but she wore size M that day. It can be seen how anxious you were before you went to the party. You didn't even give her time to change into a dress of the right size. Also, do you think the purchase record of that modified new BMW can be erased like the record of the courier company? After all, BMW is not a company you can easily threaten and control. They still have a record of car purchase. For example, you said you would give Su Shui a new car, and the car was registered in Su Shui's name, but on the day you bought the car, you swiped the card of your family's servant. A week later, you transferred money from your grandfather's card to fill the vacancy in the servant's card. Your grandfather's card has been in your hands for a long time. You went around in a big circle just to hide your car purchase record. Su Jilan's face grew paler. She looked calm, but the flicker in her eyes revealed some of her emotions. Jin Wan's exquisite face coldly smiled. The recordings and evidence I've submitted aren't enough to drag you into this. But Miss Su, you're too suspicious. The police will investigate based on this evidence. Did you think that no one would suspect you? Su Jilan pursed her lips. It's just your guess. I can understand that you don't want me to live a peaceful life, but I've been with Shui for so many years. You can't just provoke us. She won't. Her soul in heaven should be awake. Once you say these lies, aren't you afraid she will come back to kill you in the middle of the night? Jin Wan was not in the mood to argue with her. I advise you not to waste your saliva on me. If you want to explain, go in and talk to the police yourself. Jin Wan said again, the Su family is indeed rich and powerful in Los Angeles, and they can use their wealth to hide some things in the police station to keep their innocence. But now the Mo family is involved, and Mo Jingshan has not woken up yet. If the Su family wants to cover up the truth, they have to ask the Mo family first. With that, Jin Wan walked straight past Su Jilan. Su Jilan suddenly stood in front of her. Jin Wan, you know Jingshan hasn't woken up yet and you just had a miscarriage. Are you sure you have good intentions by causing a scuffle between the Su family and the Mo family at this time? The word miscarriage was really harsh to hear from Su Jilan's mouth. Feng Ling reached out and pulled Jin Wan over. Su Jilan glanced at Feng Ling and moved her lips, but in the end she just lowered her voice. Jin Wan, we'd better not involve others in our affairs. My grandfather is old and Jingshan's parents are worried sick because of Jingshan's coma. You don't have to vent your anger on all of us because of Shui's matter. Chapter 359. Su Jilan's hand trembled and she tried to free her hand, but Jin Wan held it tightly. What are you doing? Let go of me. Su Jilan struggled to break free from her hand. But Jin Wan still held her hand tightly. Her smile was cold, but her voice was so light that only Su Jilan could hear it. How can I let go of you? I won't let go of you until the murderer who killed my child is brought to justice. Jin Wan, did you think that Su Shui's death meant that there was no evidence? Did you think that the police would close the case as soon as possible while Mo Jingshan was unconscious? Did you think that no one would suspect you? Did you think that you could continue to be a spotless young lady, continue to play the role of a manic, timid, and emotional patient? Did you think that you were invulnerable? Let go of me. Su Jilan, let me tell you, I'm a calculative person. Every wound you cause me, I'll return it to you tenfold. Even if I dig out your heart, stomach, and uterus, I won't be able to get rid of the hatred in my heart for what you stole from me. Don't think the Mo family won't suspect you and no one will do anything to you even if Mo Jingshan doesn't wake up. Su Jilan was still trying to free her hand, but Jin Wan was so strong that she held her wrist so hard that she almost broke her wrist. From beginning to end, Feng Ling didn't reach out to help restrain Su Jilan, because she saw a woman who was extremely angry because she had lost her unborn child. Feng Ling had never seen Jin Wan like this. It wasn't until Jin Wan finally let go that Su Jilan was able to break free. She took a step back and looked at Jin Wan's flat belly with lingering fear. It's just your suspicion. Su Jilan calmed herself down and tried to stay away from Jin Wan. At this time a policeman came out of the police station. When he saw Su Jilan, he asked her to enter the interrogation room to record her statement. Su Jilan hesitated for a moment before turning to look at Jin Wan. Jin Wan just looked at her indifferently and said nothing. When they walked out of the police station it was snowing outside. Feng Ling wrapped the scarf around Jin Wan's neck and whispered as they walked to the car. Mrs. Mo, do you need me to inform the base about this? There's no need. Once the Mo family gets involved, the Su family won't be able to get away with it. Mo Xiaoza is the chairman of the Shine Group, and he'll put pressure on the police in person once the suspicions about Su Jilan reach him. Alright, let Director Mo do it. After all, Mr. Mo hasn't woken up yet, and he has nowhere to vent his anger. When they returned to the hospital, Mo Jingshan was still unconscious. His ward was still not open to anyone. It was already dark and Wan Zhu took Jin Wan back to the Mo family. At dinner there was soup specially made for Jin Wan. Since Jin Wan's miscarriage, she had been drinking soup almost every day to nourish her body. Jin Wan always felt that Wan Zhu was trying to find traces of her son in this world in this way. Every day Wan Zhu said nothing. The two words that everyone in this family was most afraid to hear now were sleep and vegetative state. This was the most frightening result. After dinner, Jin Wan returned to the bedroom, closed the door and went into the bathroom. After taking a shower, she sat on the edge of the bed with the laptop that Mo Jingshan had used before. She opened the mailbox and saw the work emails from Mon Wan's studio in High City, but she was not in the mood to read them. She just sat on the bed, stared at the words on the screen, and raised her hand to touch the roses in the vase beside the bed. The flowers were put in by the servants in a fixed number of rooms every day. On the night of the Spring Festival, Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan lived here, and she saw the roses in the same position. What did she say at that time? On her birthday in T-City, she didn't even touch the rose petals on the ground before she destroyed them, so now she felt sorry for the roses. She curled up on the edge of the bed, looked at the flowers, took out her cell phone, took a photo and sent it to Mo Jingshan. The flowers in your room are so beautiful every day. I haven't seen you for a month. I don't even know if you are withered or in full bloom. Sometimes people might have such a persistence, especially for the people they loved. Whether the other party was alive or dead, even if he was just a pile of yellow bones, as long as she could see him, at least she would feel at ease. But in the whole month, the only 2 times she looked in when the doctor opened the door were the 2 times she saw Mo Jingshan lying on the white hospital bed, quiet and motionless, his body full of various instruments and colorful wires and tubes. He didn't open his eyes, not even his eyelashes moved. But in the blink of an eye, the door was closed and she never saw him again. It had been a whole month. Jin Wan called Mo Jingshan 3 times a day as usual and sent him a text message before going to bed as usual. As time went by, she was also very confused. If he continued to sleep like this, did he not want her anymore? Why did he come into her life so forcefully and change her life, but then lie there quietly and motionless, making her so afraid? It was snowing heavily. After a few more snowfalls in Los Angeles in February, this winter would be over. Jin Wan was wrapped in a white cashmere coat, sitting on the stairs in front of the hospital. Her head was covered with white snow. Because she hadn't moved much, the snow hadn't melted, so there was a lot of snow on her head. From a distance, she looked like a snowman piled up on the stairs. When Qin Siding walked out of the hospital and saw this scene, he put one hand in his trouser pocket and stared at it for a long time before he walked down to Jin Wan's side, patted the snow off her head, took off his coat and put it on her. Jin Wan didn't need to turn her eyes. She just slightly tilted her head and saw it was Qin Siding's leather shoes, so she didn't move. He has been sleeping. It's meaningless for you to come here every day, Qin Siding said. I think you better go back to High City first. Your studio still needs you, and the Ji family and grandfather Mo also need you to go back and comfort them. Jin Wan silently looked at the car speeding by and said indifferently, Dr. Qin, didn't you also fly here from High City? Why haven't you gone back after staying here for so long? Your home and the focus of your work are in High City, but you have been here recently. Aren't you also waiting? Qin Siding looked down at her. After a moment, he sighed with a smile and simply sat down on the same stairs as her, looking in the same direction as Jin Wan. After a long time he said, Even I don't know when he will wake up. If he doesn't wake up for a year, are you going to wait here for a year? If he doesn't wake up for 10 years, are you going to wait for 10 years? Jin Wan didn't speak, just holding her cell phone and scrolling through the messages she had sent to Mo Jingshan. Chapter 360. Jinwan received a call from the police station. The driver of the giant truck died in prison in the early hours of this morning. Hearing this, Jinwan put on her clothes and quickly went out of the door. When she rushed to the police station, the police showed her the surveillance footage of the prison and gave her the driver's death certificate and the forensic examination results. The forensic examiner found some chronic poison in the driver's body. When the driver died, he vomited black blood, and his internal organs had been destroyed unknowingly. None of his internal organs were intact. There was nothing he could do to save him. Watching the video replay of the driver suddenly vomiting blood and falling to the ground, and then looking at the forensic examination results, Jinwan felt cold hands and feet. Prison, chronic poison, vomiting blood. This was exactly the same way she died in her previous life. She used to think that because everyone in her previous life believed that she killed the daughter of the Yun family, the family of the deceased conspired with the prison to kill her, or Ji Menggran, who was far away in the United States, had some contact with the people in the prison. At that time, she didn't know the existence of An Shuyan or Su Jilan, but it didn't mean that they didn't know her existence. So who killed her in her previous life? This was exactly the same way he died. The replay pierced Jinwan's eyes like a thorn. She could even feel the terrible pain all over the driver's body when he suddenly vomited blood and fell to the ground in prison. That suffocating feeling made her feel despair. Has Su Jilan returned to the Su family? Jinwan paused the replay and looked up at the police station. Yes, Miss Su has been taken back by her grandfather, but as a suspect, her freedom will be temporarily controlled by us, and she can't leave Los Angeles easily. Jinwan clenched the forensic examination results in her hand, looked at the scientific name of the drug on it, and kept it in mind. After leaving the police station, Jinwan used her cell phone in the car to check the ingredients and symptoms of this poison. When Feng Ling drove, she saw that Jinwan had been sitting quietly looking at her cell phone, motionless as if there was no difference from a few days ago, but there seemed to be something in her eyes. Very cold, very cold. Jinwan searched for the explanation of mania. The typical symptoms were an elevated state of mind, an increase in thinking and inner activities, overconfidence, and even exaggerated imagination and behavior. Most of the time, they would be agitated and uneasy, and they would not consider the consequences when carrying out any purpose. It was a disease that could not be seen when one was calm, but once the spirit was stimulated or when one insisted on doing something, one would be overly dark and agitated, unlike ordinary people. Therefore, Su Jilan's mania was different from Su Shui's madness. Su Shui was really crazy and irrational, while Su Jilan had confidence and darkness buried under the surface of calmness and rationality. She had all kinds of tricks up her sleeves. Back at the hospital, Qin Siding had just come out of Mo Jingshan's ward when Jinwan was already waiting in the corridor. Dr. Qin, is this kind of drug common on the market? Jinwan handed him the results of the forensic examination. Qin Siding glanced at her, took the things she handed him, looked at them, and then looked at her. This kind of chronic poison is not common in our country and can even be said to be rare, but it can be bought in some places in the United States. However, if you want to buy it, you have to go through certain channels, either with someone behind the scenes or with enough money. This kind of poison can stay in the body for 2 or 3 months without any symptoms. The drug is stable during the incubation period, but it is not certain that one day the poison will take effect and there is no cure. How does this poison enter a person's body? 2 ways: intravenous injection or ingestion through food. If it's injected, it will enter the blood vessels directly and die faster. If it's poisoned only by eating, it will die slower. The process can be long or short. I don't know much about this kind of drug, so I just know a general idea. With that, Qin Siding looked at Jinwan coldly. Haven't the police found a remittance of 5 million yuan in his account? This is obviously the way he chose to die, and his wife and children have been settled. He was injected with this poison before the incident. Feng Ling, Jinwan turned her eyes to Feng Ling behind her. Dr. Qin said that if you want to buy this kind of drug, you have to go through certain channels, which I guess only you can find out. Help me check if Su Jilan or anyone close to the Su family has recently bought this kind of drug. Okay. Feng Ling nodded. I'll send someone to check it right away. In the evening, she returned to the Mo family's home. Before she entered the door, she heard Wan Zhu and Mo Xiaoza quarreling. Jingshan hasn't woken up yet. This morning you gave the only place to visit him to in Shuyan. You can go in yourself or I can go in. When Jinwan returns to the hospital, it's understandable for Jinwan to go in to accompany Jingshan. But why did you let in Shuyan in? Jinwan just had a miscarriage. Are you trying to take advantage of Jingshan's unconsciousness to drive away the wife he has always held in the palm of his hand? You weren't here in the morning and I couldn't get to the hospital in time. Jinwan went to the police station, and Shuyan happened to go to the hospital at that time. It's reasonable for me to let her in. Besides, Jingshan is still asleep. How can he know who went in? How can he not know? Jinwan hasn't seen him for more than a month. If she goes in to accompany Jingshan, Jingshan may be able to hear her, and Jinwan may be able to wake him up. But you actually gave such a good opportunity to Shuyan. Emo Xiaoza, oh Emo Xiaoza, people around you say you are an old stubborn man and I have been protecting you. Now I find that you are really an old stubborn man. If Jinwan finds out about this, how sad she will be. Go away. I don't want to talk to you now. You old stubborn man. Jinwan stood outside the door of the Emo family's villa for a while and suddenly found that after more than a month of waiting and suffering, her heart had been dulled. She was no longer so easily angry or sensitive. However, because Emo Jingshan's condition had stabilized, she was finally allowed to go in to visit him alone. However, Emo Xiaoza didn't call her back to the hospital but let Shuyan in. He really disregarded her too much. When the villa was quiet, Jinwan pushed the door open and walked in. Wanzhu looked back at her, got up and walked up to her. Wanwan, why are you back so late? Chapter 361. The implication was that she had heard their conversation just now. Wanzhu immediately glared at Emo Xiaoza with a reproachful look. Emo Xiaoza was about to sneer at her for not giving him face, but Wanzhu glared at him. He swallowed his words, slammed the lid of the teacup in his hand and said coldly, "As you wish." Marrying such an unreasonable husband was really infuriating. Wanzhu hurriedly took Jinwan's hand. Nuan, Jingshan's condition is getting more and more stable. We'll stay in the hospital these days. As long as we can enter the ward, we'll let you in first. I know you miss him very much and want to stay with him for a while. I know. Don't be sad, child. Then Wanzhu took Jinwan back to the room, sat on the bed and held her hand saying, "In fact, Jingshan's father doesn't have much opinion of you. He just likes Shuyan so much that it can only be attributed to preconceived notions. The marriage contract between Jingshan and the Su family was just a stopgap measure. At that time, Shuyan was studying in the UK, not in the US, so Su Jilan's affair happened. In other words, in his heart, Shuyan was raised according to the standard of the Emo family's daughter-in-law. He has always been on good terms with the Yin family, and he also watched Shuyan being born and growing up, so their relationship is not the same. But Jingshan, after all, has his own ideas. He spent more time in High City, and in the years he was in America he rarely got close to his family. He rarely interacted with the Yin family, and he only met Shuyan a few times. You know what happened after that, and you know Jingshan's attitude, so don't let the stubborn ideas of Jingshan's father affect your mood. No matter what he does, he won't be so stupid as to force his son to divorce. He just doesn't want to give up and always wants to see if he can bring them together, but as long as you and Jingshan are as good as ever, he will give up after a long time. Jinwan smiled. Perhaps it was because she grew up with her mother too little. Growing up with Ji Hongwen, she never knew what it felt like to have a good mother. But at this moment she understood. Mo Jingshan, a cold and unreasonable man, occasionally showed a warm and amiable side. He must have inherited Wanzhu's good temper. But to avoid such a situation happening again, Jinwan moved back to the hospital. While Mo Jingshan was in a deep sleep, Jinwan had not been idle. She was thinking of ways to avenge her child, to avenge Mo Jingshan, and to avenge herself. Good news came from Mo Nwan's studio in High City every day. Hearing that her studio had made more than 200 million yuan in profits in the past few months, Jinwan just calmly held a video conference with everyone in the studio and continued to stay in Los Angeles. Grandfather Mo didn't know how Mo Jingshan and Jinwan were, but they had been missing for a long time and hadn't returned to High City. He hadn't even heard Mo Jingshan's voice for a long time. After learning that they were in Los Angeles, he wanted to fly to Los Angeles several times to see them, but Jinwan persuaded him not to. It was only when Ji Hongwen suddenly fell ill and was sent to the hospital that night that Jinwan's vision darkened. Her heart turned cold. Jinwan, who had been determined to stay in Los Angeles and stay with Mo Jingshan, finally wavered a little. In her previous life, she couldn't accompany Ji Hongwen in his last days. Even if Ji Hongwen's illness was caused by overwork and was not fatal, there was always a chance. Jinwan couldn't gamble. Up to now, Ji Menggran was still missing and there was no news. Shinharu was no longer at the Ji family. Ji Hongwen was the only one at home. If the servant hadn't found him early and sent him to the hospital in time, it was hard to say what would have happened. It turned out that every stage of a person's life was full of too many unknowns. Many things had to be changed, but they also had to pay the price. On the phone, the servant of the G family said, "Chairman G is now in the hospital. His life is not in danger, but he needs to be observed and may be hospitalized for a long time." "Are you going back?" Qin Siding asked her. Jinwan didn't know. She had been in the hospital for so many days, but still couldn't find a chance to enter the ward. When she finally got the chance to visit Mo Jingshan, Wan Zhu and Mo Xiaozi were there. They were Mo Jingshan's parents, so she didn't compete with them for this chance. Even though Wan Zhu wanted her to accompany Mo Jingshan, Jinwan insisted. After that, it was hard to get a chance. The sterile ward was rarely open. If it weren't for Mo Jingshan's physical fitness, he wouldn't have been able to get 2 chances to enter the ward. Jinwan received a call from the Ji family again. The servant said that Ji Hongwen had lost a lot of weight recently and hadn't been able to eat for 2 days. He vomited as much as he ate. Although the doctor said his life was not in danger, he couldn't go on like this. They were worried that Chairman Ji wouldn't be able to hold on. When Mo Jingshan slept for nearly 2 months, Jinwan finally nodded, silently packed up her things and prepared to fly back to High City. Before she left, she didn't send him any text messages. She didn't know when he would see the messages she had sent in the past dozens of days. Feng Ling accompanied her to the airport. In the airport hall, people came and went. Jinwan still remembered that when she secretly flew out of High City to Cambodia with Feng Ling, her heart had been anxious. Now, standing here, she was about to fly back to High City. She was no longer in a state of panic. But like duckweed without gravity, she floated all over the sky, unable to find an end or a home. At least at that time, she knew that Mo Jingshan was in Cambodia. She wanted to go to Cambodia to find him, and she did succeed. But where on earth was he now? After sleeping for so long, she didn't know whether she was in his dreams or where he had been in his dreams, and she couldn't find him. Feng Ling went to buy water for her, and Jinwan went to line up for the boarding pass. She only took the simplest small silver suitcase. She didn't plan to stay long in High City and planned to fly back to Los Angeles when Ji Hongwen was better, so she didn't take much with her. When they were about to go through the international security check, Feng Ling hurriedly came back with the mineral water she had just bought. Suddenly her cell phone rang. Feng Ling picked up the phone. When she heard what the other party said, her eyes changed and she turned to look at Jinwan with joy in her eyes. Holding the boarding pass and passport in her hand, Jinwan turned to look at her. "What's wrong?" Chapter 362. When Mo Jingshan woke up, he had been sleeping in the hospital for 2 months. As usual, Qin Siding wore a white coat and a mask to enter the ward. As soon as he entered, he saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were open. He couldn't help raising his eyebrows and asking incredulously, "You're awake? Are my eyes playing tricks on me?" On the white bedsheet, the man looked calm and cold. His emotionless eyes looked at the man in the white coat beside the bed. After a while he frowned. "How long have I slept?" His voice was very hoarse. "How long?" Qin Siding resisted the urge to call Jinwan immediately and stared at Mo Jingshan, who was still in a daze. 2 months. Is it long?" The man on the bed frowned and didn't speak for a while, as if he was thinking about something hard to figure out. It was not convenient to use a cell phone in this ward. Qin Siding's hand paused in his pocket. He saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were cold and strange. Although he usually looked like this when he was cold, there seemed to be something more and something missing in his eyes. "It's really lucky that you survived the car accident." Jinwan didn't wait in vain to wake up. Qin Siding smiled and sighed. When Mo Jingshan heard Jinwan's name, he suddenly raised his head and narrowed his dark eyes. "Jinwan? I say you." Qin Siding's brows twitched fiercely. "At that time, the steel bars in the car directly injured your neck and spine. These are all connected to the nerves in your brain. Did you King lose your memory?" Mo Jingshan didn't speak again. He raised his hand and pressed his slender index finger against his temple, as if he was still not very awake. "Holy shit, don't tell me you really lost your memory? Jinwan will cry to death." Qin Siding was about to come forward to examine him. Before he touched him, the man on the bed frowned coldly and said coldly, "No, I remember." There was a strong sense of alienation in his voice, which was not directed at Qin Siding but at the name Jinwan. Qin Siding felt it was a little strange. Mo Jingshan had just woken up and no one had offended him. This cold and distant aura of an absolute superior was too frightening. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "How do you feel right now?" Mo Jingshan nodded. "I'm fine. Just a headache." Mo Jingshan's voice was low and hoarse. His eyes were closed and he was not used to the light in the ward. Qin Siding turned around and drew the curtains. When he turned back, he saw that Mo Jingshan had opened his eyes. The room suddenly dimmed and darkened, covering his deep eyes. Qin Siding turned on the light wall lamp in the ward, took out his cell phone to check the time and said, "I'll go out to inform your attending doctor, uncle and aunt and then call Jean Wan. She's probably at the airport now. She hasn't woken up for 2 months. She's finally ready to go back to High City to see her father, but you woke up just in time. I hope she hasn't boarded the plane yet." Mo Jingshan looked at the phone that Qin Siding took out without batting an eyelid. Looking at the model of the phone, he was silent for a long time and did not speak. An hour later, the medical staff came and went in the ward. Mo Xiaoza and Wan Zhu, who got the news, rushed to the hospital, but they didn't even see Mo Jingshan before the door of the ward was closed. Mo Jingshan didn't see anyone. The light in the room was dim and the man on the hospital bed had a sore throat. After Qin Siding walked out, he closed the door and quietly lay back on the bed. What entered his eyes was the white ceiling. In the empty, luxurious ward, the sound of the air conditioner was so weak that it could not be heard. He closed his eyes. After sleeping for 2 months, he had a very long dream. Who he was, he remembered. Who Jean Wan was, he remembered. He remembered how the car accident happened. He remembered the scene when Jean Wan rolled down from the car in front of him. When the huge impact happened, the steel bar in the car pierced his shoulder. He also remembered that he heard Jean Wan's cries in the car and heard Feng Ling say worriedly that her lower body was bleeding. He remembered, the phone was quietly placed by the bed. He didn't know if anyone had charged it for him in the past 2 months. Mo Jingshan opened his eyes. After 2 months of sleep and recuperation, the wounds that should be healed had already healed. These movements of getting up and raising his hand were no longer affected. He picked up the phone on the white table beside the bed. The time shown on the phone was March 13, 200x. His gaze paused for a moment and his head began to hurt again. There were dozens of missed calls and text messages on the phone. He opened them and found that most of them were from Jean Wan. Mo Jingshan, I'm scared. When will you wake up? I couldn't save our baby. You're angry, aren't you? I dreamed you woke up. Love you. Mo Jingshan, I love you. I love you very much. So don't keep sleeping like this. Wake up. If I knew that you would use such a method to save my life, I would rather die with Su Shui in that car than have you die for me. It's so cold today, but I can't stay in your ward. Is your bed warm? Can I sleep with you? I haven't seen you for half a month. I miss you so much. The doctor said you're likely to keep sleeping like this. Do you not want me anymore? Mo Jingshan, I miss you. Still won't wake up? I'm scared. I'm scared every day. The man on the bed quietly read the text messages. Until he finished reading dozens of them, he remained expressionless. His black, cold eyes carefully read them one by one and then he clicked the option to delete them all. Then Mo Jingshan rubbed his still aching brows and found the phone number of the person in charge of the Mo Corporation Legal Center in High City in his contact list. After the call was connected, the other party said in surprise, "COMO. Prepare 2 divorce agreements before the end of the month." Divorce agreements? Who wants a divorce? Me and Jean Wan. This marriage started in the Civil Affairs Bureau of High City, and according to the law, it had to end in High City. Qin Siding had just pushed open the door of the ward with the medicine when he suddenly heard Mo Jingshan's words. He almost dropped the medicine bottle in his hand and looked at the cold, pale man as if he had seen a ghost. Mo Jingshan's expression didn't change at all when Qin Siding came in. He hung up the phone, threw it aside and closed his eyes. You want to divorce Jean Wan? Qin Siding frowned. He knew Mo Jingshan too well. Although many people couldn't see through Mo Jingshan, Nan Heng and Qin Siding had been with him for so many years, and they always understood what he did more than they were curious about him. Mo Jingshan never did things that were too impulsive or unreasonable. He was too calm and rational. Not to mention how impeccable he was in the business world, he was absolutely considerate in marriage and love, and would never allow any misunderstanding or flaw to occur. Chapter 363. Mo Jingshan didn't answer him. Qin Siding put down the medicine and stared at his indifferent and calm face. What the hell is going on? Who gave you a magic potion? You even forgot the woman you've been holding in your heart? Or did you suddenly realize how good it was to be single in the past 2 months, so you abandoned your woman for no reason? The man on the bed didn't speak. He was so cold and expressionless that he seemed to be isolated from the world. Qin Siding was so angry that he wanted to curse. Do you know how long Jinwan has been waiting outside the ward every day for the past 2 months? She, a woman who just had a miscarriage, knew she couldn't see you through the wall and the door, but she still insisted on waiting here every day. You almost died in the car accident and so did she. You two have been through so much together and it's not the first time you've been through life and death together. Now you suddenly say you want a divorce? Are you King stupid? Mo Jingshan closed his eyes and said flatly, "Get out." Qin Siding was about to speak, when he suddenly heard footsteps coming from outside the ward and heard Feng Ling calling Jinwan to slow down. He paused and looked at the man on the bed whose eyes were closed and whose face was cold. Jinwan is coming. I'll stop her first. You'd better wake up as soon as possible. With that, he turned around and walked out. Jinwan hurried to the hospital and saw that Mo Xiaozi, Wanzhu, and the others were all waiting at the door. Qin Siding came out of the ward, glanced at everyone's face and finally fixed his eyes on Jinwan. Jinwan rushed back from the airport. Los Angeles airport was very far away, and it only took them 1.5 hours to get back. When Jinwan ran in from the hospital, even Feng Ling, who was behind her, almost couldn't catch up with her. The breathless woman stared at Qin Siding and then at the door of the ward behind him, asking, "Is he awake? Is he really awake?" Qin Siding glanced at her calmly and felt a headache coming on. He raised his hand and pinched between his eyebrows. Yes, he's awake, but he's been sleeping for too long. It's not suitable for him to see too many people now. Let him calm down first. Jinwan immediately smiled. It's all right. It's good that he's awake, it's good that he's awake. It didn't matter if she couldn't see him. She had already waited for 2 months. It didn't matter if she waited a little longer. As long as he woke up, it would be fine. He was not in a coma and did not become a vegetable. The doctor had said that as long as he could wake up, there would be no more problems. She was afraid that he would not wake up. As long as he woke up, everything would be fine. Her Mo Jingshan did not leave. He had returned. Seeing the overjoyed expression on the woman's face, Qin Siding's tone turned bitter, and he could not speak for a while. After a while, he comforted Wanzhu and Mo Xiaozi, telling them to go back and rest and wait for his call. Jinwan still insisted on staying in the hospital, and Qin Siding didn't force her to leave. When he saw Jinwan put her suitcase against the wall, sat alone on the bench outside the ward, and waited as patiently as ever, he looked at her in silence for a long time. After a moment he asked, "You're not going back to High City? Let's see how it goes." I called High City on the way back to the hospital from the airport. The servant said that my father can eat something today, and his condition is better than 2 days ago. Qin Siding nodded. After waiting for a whole night, Jinwan did not enter the ward. Every time Qin Siding came out and saw her, he persuaded her to go back to rest or sleep in the nurse's lounge. But since Jinwan knew that Mo Jingshan had woken up, she couldn't fall asleep. At least let her see him. If she couldn't see him tonight, she could wait until tomorrow. She could wait. In the early morning when it was almost dawn, Qin Siding opened the door and took a look. Suddenly, he turned back to the ward with an ugly face and looked at Mo Jingshan, who had not slept since he woke up. It's cold in the corridor. She has been sitting there motionless like a good baby all afternoon and all night. I can't stand it anymore. Take care of your woman. I'll go to the nurse's lounge to sleep for a while. Qin Siding said and turned to leave. When he closed the door he made a big noise. Jinwan turned her eyes and looked at Qin Siding's back strangely, wondering why he was so angry. She turned back to see that the door of the ward was not completely closed. Because he closed it too hard, it bounced back, leaving a small gap. The door was not locked, the other medical staff were not here, and Dr. Qin had left. There was a gap in the door and Mo Jingshan had woken up. Everything seemed to tell her that she could go in. Even if he was temporarily asleep, she could go in to see him now. But Qin Siding said during the day that he needed quiet now. Jinwan licked her dry lips, stared at the small gap in the door for a long time, hesitated for a long time, but did not get up and go in. She continued to sit on the bench outside the door. Before Mo Jingshan agreed to let other medical staff in, she would respect his choice and wait patiently. The ward was very quiet. Mo Jingshan silently looked at the gap in front of the door. The lights in the ward were very dim, but the lights in the corridor were very bright. He could see the figure on the bench through the small gap. As Qin Siding had said, she sat there like an obedient baby and did not make any noise or movement. It was as though she was afraid of disturbing him, or afraid of being driven away by the medical staff and not allowing her to continue staying here. It was gradually 6:30 in the morning and she was still sitting there motionless. Mo Jingshan was silent for a moment, lifted the quilt and got out of bed. Looking at the figure outside the door, he slowly walked to the door and put his hand on it. At this time the hospital was very quiet. Jinwan was still not sleepy. Even though Mo Jingshan's footsteps were very light, she still heard them. She turned her eyes abruptly, and the moment the door was opened, she met the man's dark, cold eyes. Jinwan stood up abruptly, but because she had been sitting all night, her legs were numb. She staggered and almost lost her balance. She raised her hands to support herself on the bench to prevent herself from falling down awkwardly. She then looked up at the man in the door. "Why did you get out of bed? You just woke up. Did the doctor say you can walk around now?" Jinwan hammered her numb legs, straightened up and walked up to him. When she reached the door of the ward, the homesickness was gone. She saw that Mo Jingshan was only a little thinner than before the accident, but there was no change. He was still him, the man she was familiar with. Chapter 364. With that, she leaned against the wall with a joyful expression, meeting the man's cold and emotionless eyes at such a close distance. The smile on her face gradually faded with his alienation and indifference. Finally, as if reading something in his deep eyes, her lips trembled. Why are you looking at me like this?" Mo Jingshan looked at her heavily. "How should I look at you?" At the very least, he shouldn't look at her so coldly as if she was a stranger, unrelated to him or even emotionless. Jinwan paused and suddenly turned to look at the door. Then she turned back to look at him. "If it's because you just woke up and your body is not used to it, I'll go out now. You rest quietly. I'll stay with you outside. I won't leave or come in to disturb you, Miss G." The man's warm and cold voice came into her ears, but it seemed that after 10 years, the man who drew parallel lines with her life was pulled back in front of her eyes. In the large ward, the light poured on the floor and the transparent dust floated up and down in the air, but the ward was silent. Only Mo Jingshan's bone-chilling voice resounded. Jinwan's eyes suddenly froze. "Miss G?" Mo Jingshan looked at her coldly. "Don't be so surprised. Whether it was 10 years ago or 10 years ago, everything should return to its original point, and it should find the original track." The ward was frighteningly quiet. Such Mo Jingshan, such a him, for some reason she had a feeling that she had never found him. He was as far away from her as he was 10 years later, untouchable, unseen and unfathomable. Coupled with his words, she felt as if she had been splashed with a bucket of cold water. Her whole body was cold and she almost lost her balance against the wall. All the joy she felt because he had finally woken up cooled in an instant. She stared at his eyes, but could not find any of the warmth and concern she had in the past. The deep love and sweetness were all gone. He was Mo Jingshan, but not the Mo Jingshan she was familiar with. He was different. Her lips moved. I'm still me. I haven't forgotten anything." The man's voice was indifferent but cruel. "It's just that I slept for too long and had a long dream." Jinwan understood almost instantly, and the blood in her body almost froze at this moment. He knew everything. What she was most afraid of was that Mo Jingshan would know that she had been reborn. What she was most afraid of was that he would know that she had followed him closely from the beginning to change the course of her life. She just wanted to live a better life, but now the nightmare had come. Because she had stuck to this marriage with a purpose from the beginning, even though the result had changed and was far from what she had thought at the beginning. However, in the face of such a man who could instantly analyze what she had done when she had just been reborn, she was like a traveler who had hidden too many stolen goods in her backpack. He saw through her at a glance, and she was naked and unreservedly torn apart by him. Without thinking, Jinwan suddenly raised her hand to clench the man's clothes, struggling to approach him, but Mo Jingshan didn't give her a chance to approach. He quietly avoided her hand and ignored her pale face. His deep and cold eyes only looked at the door of the ward, meaning that she could go. Jinwan's face was almost transparent. She had never been so pale even when she was lying in the operating room during the abortion. Her voice was empty. His cold words hit her. "After returning to High City, I'll sign the divorce agreement to you as soon as possible." Jinwan looked up at him and asked blankly, "Divorce?" A strange smile appeared on Mo Jingshan's cold and indifferent face. It seemed to be a mocking smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I've used what I can and it's time to end it. I'm just doing as you wish." The tall and straight man looks down at her. There is only indifference and gloominess in his eyes. The curve of his thin lips no longer has any warmth in the past. It is like an ice needle piercing people's pain. Doing as she wished? If she had been clear-headed enough, she wouldn't have led her life to such a state. To her, he was the best Jingxian in the world. She would never willingly give him up. She could say that she did it to live a better life in this life, or she had ulterior motives. But right now she truly loved him. She couldn't leave him. She truly wanted to live happily with him for the rest of her life. She truly wanted to live happily with him for the rest of her life. She didn't want to leave him. Divorce? How could she? She didn't intend to divorce him again in this life. Jinwan opened her mouth and wanted to say something, only to find that sometimes words were really pale and powerless. When they met his eyes again, she raised her hand and raised the skin on the back of her hand and wrist, which were still slightly red from the burn she had suffered in Cambodia, to his eyes. Jingxian, can we pretend that everything we've experienced between us doesn't exist? The man looked at her hand silently and didn't speak. Can we pretend that all the feelings between us don't exist? Jinwan stared at him. Can all the promises we've made and vows we've held for so long be returned to zero because of your big dream? Jinwan's face was full of tears, and she raised her hand to grab his collar. Jingxian, I exchanged my life for my present life, my home, my husband, I exchanged my heart for it. What right do you have to deny everything about me now? Jingxian bent down slightly because of the strength of her grip and didn't break free. Looking at her tearful face, he gradually sneered. This was the first time that he didn't have any intention of coaxing or hugging her when he saw her cry. He just watched her cry, and there was no other emotion in his eyes except coldness and sarcasm. He pinched her chin and narrowed his eyes. Life is really biased towards you. His voice paused for a moment and he stared into her eyes. Do you love me very much now? Jinwan froze and then nodded firmly. Jingxian seemed to have heard the funniest joke in the world, and his hand pinched her chin harder. Jinwan, I've seen too many people who know how to adapt to circumstances, but I've never seen someone as sensible as you. You know exactly what you want, and you spare no effort to fight for it. Isn't it all because you don't want to become that poor soul in prison who died with blood? Jinwan's tears welled up. She wanted to say no, but the man's eyes were too cold and his fingers on her chin were too hard. Chapter 365. Jinwan stared at him blankly. She couldn't believe that such heartless words would come from Jingxian's mouth. What kind of mood did she have when she went to bed with him that night? She just didn't want a divorce again. She just wanted to cherish everything in front of her. She didn't want to take advantage of anyone. But in the ears of Jingxian, who had the memory of 10 years later, these words were just another joke. When Jinwan's jaw almost couldn't bear the pain, Jingxian suddenly loosened his fingers. His pale and cold face seemed gentle, but the temperature between his eyes was so cold that it made her shudder. Don't cry. Your tears mean nothing to me. Jingxian. Looking at his eyes, Jinwan felt as if a big hole had been dug in her heart, and her hands unconsciously tightened the corner of his clothes again. Jingxian glanced at her fingers and sneered softly. You are still used to acting like a spoiled child in front of me. I didn't take advantage of you. I just don't want to make the same mistake again. I just try hard to cherish you and... Cherish what? Jingxian's hands hung by his sides as if he didn't even want to touch her again. His eyes were cold. Cherish the comfort that belongs to Mrs. and don't have to live a homeless life for another 10 years? His thin lips were indifferent and cold to the bone. You have everything you want now, your studio is thriving and the future is promising, and I just return everything between you and me to the original point, return your freedom and let myself go. With that, he looked at her tears, took a step back and took the corner of his clothes out of her hands. He took a few steps back until he kept a suitable distance from her. He looked coldly at the woman who was standing against the wall with a face even paler than his. He said with a cold smile, Are you afraid of losing everything again? Jinwan looked at him, and her tears suddenly froze in her eyes and couldn't fall anymore. She closed her eyes. Can we have a good talk? Forget it, Jinwan. Jingxian's thin lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth at all. He appeared colder than ever. Everything between us has long ended. The marriage and feelings you thought you could salvage are just flowers in a mirror and the moon in the water. Right now, I have no interest in you at all. I don't even feel the need to take another look at you. You clearly remember everything. Jingxian, why must you abandon all the good memories? Why must you push me away? You can even give up your life, but now you don't want me, right? The man glanced at her indifferently, staring at her tears that were rolling down her face. Jinwan had never cried in front of him like this, nor had she cried so sadly. His hands were by his side and he did not raise them to wipe her tears. When Jinwan took a step forward, he coldly stepped back, not giving her a chance to touch him. "All right, Jinwan, this 10-month joke can come to an end. You know how far apart we are from each other, but you still pretend to be affectionate. It's too boring." Step by step, she finally came here and watched him sacrifice his life to save her. No matter how hurtful his words were, Jinwan still tried to keep calm and chose to believe that he would not abandon her so easily. She sobbed, raised her hand and wiped her tears with her sleeve. "Jingshan, does your body still hurt? Your head and you." Jinwan's hand, which had just reached out to his arm, was instantly waved away by him. Jinwan stubbornly stepped forward to hold him, but her hand was still pushed away by him, and he even ruthlessly threw her back to the door. "You don't want to leave? I'll give you the ward. I'm leaving." Mo Jingshan walked to the door without looking back. When he held the doorknob and was about to open it, he paused because of a sudden impact on his back. He looked sideways at the woman who suddenly rushed over and hugged him tightly from behind. His expression was indifferent, and his thin lips were drawn into a long and distant curve. "Your slutty look really makes me lose my appetite." Jinwan's heart seemed to be pierced by tens of thousands of needles. Because of his ruthless words, she felt as if there was a gush of blood gushing out of her chest. Even when she was about to die, she was not as desperate and terrible as she was now. "Let go." The man's tone was cold. She held his body, which had become thinner because of his long sleep, tightly circled his waist behind his back and stubbornly said, "Mo Jingshan, I'm your wife. You can't do this to me." "What? Are you?" His voice was cold. "Always. Ha." The man coldly sneered, put his hand on her hand and slightly forced it open. "Let go." "I won't let go." However, although he had slept in the hospital for so long, he still had some strength. He directly pried Jinwan's trembling hand off his waist and ruthlessly threw her aside. When Jinwan staggered back 2 steps and almost fell, she looked up only to see that the door was opened, and the man's back had already been opened. His long legs spread and he walked away mercilessly. The door of the ward was opened and closed. Hearing this sound, Jinwan's mind went blank. Mo Jingshan. Jinwan stood stiffly in place for a long time. The temperature in the room suddenly seemed to be piercingly cold. Her eyes trembled and she jerked the door open and chased out. However, when she looked around the corridor outside the ward, she couldn't find Mo Jingshan. He had just woken up. Even if his wounds had healed, it was inevitable that he would still be a little weak. Why did he leave so quickly? Or where did he go? The floor here was very high and the elevator quietly stopped on the first floor, so he couldn't have entered the elevator just now. Jinwan's eyes quickly searched everything around her, and her eyes suddenly rested in the direction of the escalator not far away. She hurriedly walked over, opened the door of the escalator, and saw the automatic sensor lights in the escalator instantly turn on, cooling every step that was cold and full of the smell of disinfectant. She couldn't care about anything else and rushed in without thinking. The upstairs were all doctors' offices. He shouldn't have gone there. Maybe he went downstairs. Jinwan hurriedly ran downstairs, but even after running several floors she couldn't find Mo Jingshan. Regardless of anything, she ran down every floor and looked into the corridor. She couldn't find him, so she continued to run down. She couldn't find him, couldn't find him, couldn't find him. In her previous life he had said that he would completely leave her life, and then he disappeared for a whole 10 years. Until she died, she could only hear the news of him returning to China on TV, and she couldn't even see him. Was he going to disappear from her life again? How could it be? Chapter 366. When Feng Ling found Jinwan, Jinwan was searching every floor like a wandering ghost. Even some family members outside the other wards were startled by her. "Mrs. Mo?" Feng Ling hurried forward. Jinwan seemed not to hear her. She turned into the escalator and went down. She had searched more than a dozen floors and her feet and legs were numb. As soon as she stepped on the stairs, her legs suddenly softened and she staggered forward. "Jinwan." Feng Ling quickly rushed over to support her, but she was still a step too late. One of Jinwan's knees had just touched the edge of the stairs. Although it was separated by a layer of trousers, she didn't need to lift the trousers to know that it must be bruised. "What the hell are you doing? Isn't Mr. Mo awake? What's wrong?" Feng Ling pulled her hard until she was dragged to the bench in front of the door of the next floor. She rubbed her legs and looked at her with concern. Jinwan didn't speak as if she couldn't feel the pain. Not long after, Jinwan was forcibly taken to the hospital's lounge by Feng Ling. She called the doctor over to apply some medicine to her knee and then sat by her side to accompany her. Jinwan was silent for a long time and suddenly leaned her head on Feng Ling's shoulder. She said, "I'm in so much pain." Feng Ling paused and looked down at her. "Where does it hurt? Shall I call the doctor over?" Jinwan slowly raised her hand and pointed to her heart. "Here." Feng Ling frowned and roughly understood what Jinwan meant. But what she couldn't understand was that Mr. Mo finally woke up. Shouldn't he be happy? Why did Jinwan look as if she suddenly lost the whole world, like a child abandoned in a corner of the world, so confused? Heartache. Why did she feel heartache? "Jinwan? Feng Ling, I want to be alone for a while." Jinwan closed her eyes and said softly, "Are you worried about High City? Haven't you contacted the Ji family's servants? If you're really worried, we can fly back today, visit your father, and then fly back immediately. We can come back in a day or two." Jinwan smiled bitterly and shook her head. "It's all right. Let me be alone for a while." Feng Ling was silent for a moment, stood up and walked out. There was no one in the lounge and the sun had just risen. Jinwan sat quietly for a while, got up, walked out and entered the elevator. Feng Ling didn't follow her but just watched from the side. When the elevator reached the top floor of the hospital, she immediately frowned. Qin Siding woke up. In fact, he had slept for less than 2 hours. When he went to the ward, Mo Jingshan was standing by the window. "Where's Jinwan? Did she just come in? Why isn't he outside now?" Qin Siding asked. The man in front of the window did not answer. The room was silent and cold. Qin Siding narrowed his eyes coldly and then gritted his teeth. "Don't tell me you've already said that to her?" The man remained silent. "Damn it, among us, only you and Jinwan had a smooth journey and lived a comfortable and happy life. Now that we survived the disaster, shouldn't we cherish the people in front of us more? You can even give up your life for her, and she dares to put herself in the hinterland of a minefield for you. With such deep-rooted feelings, how can you divorce her? Are you King kidding me?" Qin Siding scolded. "Do you want to go down to the sea to accompany me in difficulties because you see me suffering from Shinian's torture? You have to see if Jinwan agrees or not. She is much more persistent than I thought. She has never wavered or given up on you. How can you just push away such a woman who follows you so firmly?" When Nanheng came in, he felt that the ward was a little tense, but the person who was at daggers drawn was Qin Siding. Mo Jingshan, who had slept for 2 months and had just woken up for a day, just stood silently in front of the window and didn't move. "Since you've woken up, you should leave the hospital as soon as possible. Go back to the Mo family to recuperate or go back to High City. I'm really tired of staying in a place like a hospital now." Nanheng said, turned on the light in the ward and then turned to look at Qin Siding. "You haven't had a good rest these days when he was asleep. Go back to High City and love your Miss Sure as soon as possible." Qin Siding didn't speak but took a deep breath, turned to sit on the sofa by the window, and stared straight at the person in front of the window. Mo Jingshan glanced at him. "Why are you so free to meddle in other people's business now?" Qin Siding snorted. "I don't necessarily care about other people's business, but I'm one of your attending doctors. Seeing that you, a normal man, seem to have a mental problem after waking up, I'm considering whether to examine your brain again." Nanheng raised his eyebrows. Just now, when he found that Jinwan was not outside and there were only Mo Jingshan and Qin Siding in the ward, he guessed that something was wrong, but he didn't know what exactly happened. Now he heard Qin Siding said that Mo Jingshan had a mental problem. Nanheng sneered, leaned against the door, took out a lighter from his pocket and played with it. Suddenly he heard familiar footsteps outside and he knew it was Feng Ling. At the moment when the door of the ward was knocked, he didn't even need to ask and directly opened the door. Feng Ling stood in front of the door and looked directly at Mo Jingshan in front of the window, saying, "Mr. Mo, Mrs. Mo has gone to the rooftop." Nanheng raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Went to the rooftop? What was wrong with this woman?" Qin Siding also frowned in an instant. Mo Jingshan, however, looked particularly calm and said indifferently, "You are her bodyguard. She went to the rooftop. Why didn't you follow her? What are you doing here?" Nanheng, it seemed that he had heard something terrible. Feng Ling said coldly, "Mrs. Mo said she wanted to be alone and didn't let me follow her." The view on the rooftop was indeed very broad. Jinwan stood on it and enjoyed the wind for a while. Then she stood at the edge, found a place to sit against the railing, and stared blankly at half of Los Angeles. She only sat here for a while, probably less than a few minutes, when the metal door on the rooftop was suddenly kicked open with a bang. A gust of wind blew. Jinwan narrowed her eyes and heard Feng Ling's voice behind her. Mrs. Amo, Mr. Amo asked me to take you down. Chapter 367. Feng Ling came over and stood by Jinwan's side. If you're in a bad mood, you can tell me or find another way to vent. This place is really not safe. I know it's not safe, so I just sit behind the railing. Jinwan said slowly. I just want to enjoy the wind here. Besides, she paused and smiled reluctantly. It's useless for you to tell him. He knows I won't seek death easily. He asked you to take me down just to be polite. During the 10 years of wandering, no matter how much she suffered, how she suffered, she never sought death. Her life was tenacious. The only time she sought death was when Ji Minggran destroyed her rationality. She lay in the bathtub, cut her wrists, and foolishly pushed this man away. Even at the last moment of her life, it was because she had taken slow-acting poison for a long time. If she was given the choice, she would choose to live on. She would never take things too hard. Mo Jingshan knew her well. Her heart was hard and her skin was thick. This was the current her in his eyes. Feng Ling's lips moved and she asked curiously, why did it suddenly become like this? Weren't you and Mr. Mo fine before? Yes, why did it become like this? Jinwan sat cross-legged, looked at the sky, and squeezed out a smile. Her voice was a little hollow. Maybe it's because of cause and effect. God gave me such a beautiful dream, but in the end he took it back cruelly. Feng Ling didn't understand and didn't ask more. Seeing that Jinwan was just sitting there obediently and didn't do anything dangerous, she sat down beside her. Jinwan raised her hand and grasped in the wind. She felt a trace of cold air passing through her palm and then dissipated silently. It was as if she had thought she had finally grasped the happiness in front of her and finally learned to cherish it, but it turned out that it was just like a mass of air. It would dissipate if she said it would dissipate. To be honest, even Jinwan didn't know how to face the Mo Jingshan 10 years later. Now, except for the loving memories of the past few months, he was still the same old him, the indifferent superior, the man who had completely withdrawn from her life. But could all these beautiful memories really be thrown away like garbage to him? Jinwan looked at her empty palm for a long time and found that her eyes were very dry. Not even a single tear could fall. The wind is too strong here. Don't sit here for too long, Feng Ling said. I know. Just sit for a while longer. As Jinwan spoke, she stubbornly raised her hand and caught 2 more times in the wind. This place was too high and there was not even a speck of dust. The wind swept past her palm, leaving no trace. Mo Jingshan's physical condition was no longer a problem. After he woke up, the doctor conducted a series of examinations and observations on his current condition. After confirming that he could be discharged in a few days, his ward was also transferred to a normal ward. He was no longer restricted from family visits, so his ward was particularly lively these days. Wanju sat by the bed, peeling an apple and talking about what had happened in the past 2 months. Mo Xiaoza occasionally answered a call from the company and sat by the bed to ask Mo Jingshan how he was feeling. Kei, Nanhang and Qin Siding were busy all over the place. But the man on the bed was always calm and indifferent. At this time the door opened again. Wanju took a look and said with a smile, Nuan, what's wrong with you these days? When Mo Jingshan was unconscious, you couldn't wait to stay outside for 24 hours every day. Why did you say you were going to rest and sleep these days? You finally woke up and finally relaxed, didn't you? Jinwan smiled and walked to the bed. Yes, it's rare for me to relax, so I took some time to sleep. She didn't go to sleep, but because the owner of this ward didn't want to see her. Go to sleep. Anyway, Jingshan's body is fine now. There's still us here. You have to take good care of your body. After returning to High City, try to get pregnant as soon as possible. Previously you often moved the fetus. It's probably because this child is not fated with our Mo family. Mr. Mo still doesn't know what happened, so don't tell him. You and Jingshan are still young. There are too many women at your age who can't keep their babies after only 1 or 2 months. Jingshan's father and I are open-minded. As long as you take good care of your body, you can have another baby at any time. After all, you and Jingshan have always been so close. Hurry up and have another baby so that Mr. Mo can be happy. Wanju said as she handed the peeled apple to Jinwan. Jingshan doesn't have an appetite. Here, eat it. Jinwan took it and kept a smile on her face. Thank you. You've been keeping what happened to Jingshan in your heart. I didn't ask you to call me Mom, but it's been so long. Shouldn't you call me Mom? Wanju smiled. Jinwan's expression faltered, and she glanced at the man on the sickbed, but all she saw was the same indifference as before. Mo Jingshan didn't even look at her from beginning to end. Kay was talking to him and his eyes were on Kay. If it were in the past, if Wanju asked her to call her mom, she would definitely do so, but now, even if she wanted to, she suddenly couldn't say it. Her throat was a little dry, and when she saw that Mo Jingshan didn't even look at her, she couldn't help clenching the apple in her hand. Oh, look at me. I was too happy these days and forgot that there are too many people here. You must be embarrassed. Let's talk about it when we get home. Wanju took Jinwan's hand with a smile. Jingshan plans to go back to High City next week. Although the doctor said he's fine, I'm still worried. Remember to call me when you go back with him and tell me about his condition. And you've been too thin recently. You must put on a few pounds. Jinwan nodded. Jinwan just nodded and couldn't say a word. Wanju suddenly leaned over to Mo Jingshan and said something, but from the way she looked at Jinwan from time to time, Jinwan guessed that she was asking Mo Jingshan to treat Jinwan well and have another child as soon as possible. Mo Jingshan didn't respond, and Wanju just thought it was inconvenient for him to be too friendly to Jinwan because there were too many people here, so she didn't take it seriously. The ward was very lively, and Jinwan hadn't felt such a lively atmosphere for a long time. Then Mo Jingshan suddenly coughed in a low voice, and she subconsciously put down the apple in her hand, turned around and quickly poured him a glass of water. Mo Jingshan looked at the glass of water she handed him and didn't take it. I don't want to drink it. Take it away. Jinwan's hand holding the glass froze awkwardly on the spot. The author's words. 1. The male lead is not dead, nor is he reborn. He just knows a lot of things about his previous life and many things that the female lead doesn't know. Both of them have the memories of 2 lives and they are complete. 2. Neither of their characters has collapsed, and the plot is still the same as when I wrote the Cambodia novel. It's a plot I've set up in my outline. I'm used to holding back. Although this may cause me to lose some readers who are impatient or can't stand the abuse, thank you for your support, but I still stick to my writing direction. There's no need to tell me in the comments and on Weibo that you're giving up writing. Reading is like watching TV series. If you like it, watch it every day. If you don't, just turn it off. If you're happy, I'm happy. If you're not, I'm not happy. 3. I don't like spoilers, but Mo Tiantan is still the old Mo Tiantan. He just has some memories. For Jinwan, he can even risk his life. How can he not love her when he wakes up? Chapter 368. Wanju took the glass of water and said with a smile, You're really my daughter-in-law. You just won't drink it. You don't even say a word of courtesy. With that, she put the glass aside and turned to look at Jinwan. Sit down and rest. We'll take care of Jingshan. When you return to High City, you'll take care of him. Don't worry. At this time, Qin Sighting entered the ward and said after hearing their conversation, He's fine now. As long as the occasional headache subsides, he'll be fine. Even if he returns to High City, he doesn't need special care. After all, he has been asleep for 2 months. Everything that should be healed has been healed. Wanju nodded happily. That's great. Otherwise, I won't feel at ease to let them go back. Jinwan didn't sit down but took 2 steps back to stand by the window. Qin Sighting said a few more words to Wanju and turned to look at her. Jinwan, come here and help me get the medicine. Okay. Jinwan was really at a loss in this ward. If there were no one else here, she might have a chance to talk to Mo Jingshan. But now she couldn't even get a word in. After leaving the ward, Qin Sighting walked in front and she followed behind. When she went to get the medicine, Qin Sighting glanced back at her. What exactly happened between the 2 of you? Nothing. Just a small matter. It'll be all right after we return to High City. Jinwan lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes at all, and she was obviously not telling the truth. Seeing that she didn't intend to tell him the truth, Qin Sighting didn't ask any more curiously. He handed the medicine to her and patted her on the shoulder. Take care of yourself. Don't be like me. Love is the most difficult thing to deal with. Jinwan nodded. In her previous life she was too troublesome. She caused so much trouble in front of Mo Jingshan that he lost all his tolerance and patience for her. The current Mo Jingshan was the Mo Jingshan she had once single-handedly created, a Mo Jingshan who was far beyond her reach. The Mo Jingshan now was so strange that she couldn't feel at ease. He obviously doesn't intend to let his parents know about the current situation between you and him. It seems peaceful here in Los Angeles, but when he returns to High City, I'm afraid many things will be under his control. You'd better be prepared. Although Qin Sighting felt it was cruel, he still said it. I know, but I won't divorce him, never, Jinwan said softly. Qin Siding raised his eyebrows. I hope you can hold on. 4 days later, Mo Jingshan was discharged. 3 days later, it would be time for him to return to High City. Mo Jingshan immediately booked a flight back to High City. 3 days after he was discharged from the hospital, after Wanzhu's repeated persuasion, he finally agreed to stay at the Mo family for a few days. On the day of discharge, the weather was very cold and windy. Many people who had been difficult to enter the ward to visit were waiting in front of the hospital, including the people who settled down. Father and said to Mo Xiaozi with a smile, young people are always in good health. After such a big accident, he will recover after a good rest for 2 months, unlike us who are old and can't even recover from a fall. Mo Xiaozi smiled. You're right. We have to accept our old age. Our physical quality is different from that of young people. Father and went to greet Mo Jingshan, and Mo Jingshan nodded to him. They had just walked down the stairs in front of the hospital, and there was still a long way to go to the parking place. Jinwan felt the wind was too strong. She had brought Mo Jingshan's coat, which was in the bag in Kay's hand. Jinwan turned to take the coat from Kay and quickly came to Mo Jingshan's side. She was about to put the coat on him, but Mo Jingshan took a step forward calmly and avoided the coat she was about to put on him as if he didn't see her. Jinwan paused and was about to move forward when she suddenly heard Shuyan say, Jingshan, put on a coat. The wind is too strong. As she spoke, Shuyan placed a dark gray coat on Mo Jingshan's back. It was unclear if it was newly bought or if she had gone to the Mo family to retrieve it. Mo Jingshan didn't avoid it, and his face was calm, showing no sign of refusal or dissatisfaction. Jinwan stopped and stood behind the crowd. At this moment, almost no one paid attention to her, and she was the only one who could feel this little indifference and neglect. Mrs. Mo, this coat. Kay came over and handed the bag to her. Why don't you put it in first? Jinwan handed the coat to Kay and turned to see that Shuyan was in the crowd. Since she put the coat on Mo Jingshan, she had been walking beside him. When they came to the car door, she raised her hand to help him. When the man's slender figure got into the car, his arm was held by Shuyan and he didn't move it away. The feeling that a big piece of her heart had been dug out came again. When everyone left, got in the car and finally got into the car Mo Jingshan took, Mo Jingshan had closed his eyes and sat silently on the leather chair in the car. She didn't know whether he was asleep or just taking a nap, but he didn't look at Jinwan from beginning to end, as if he didn't care when she got in the car or whether she got in the car or not. This was a high-end limousine and it was very stable. Right now there were many people sitting in the car. Although the family did not come up, Mo Jingshan was still wearing the coat and Shu Qian had draped over him. Wan, is there anything you want to buy? If not, let's go back to the Mo family. You and Jingshan can have a good rest at the Mo family these days before going back to High City, Wanzhu asked in the car. No. Wanzhu signaled the driver to drive. She didn't think there was anything wrong with Mo Jingshan, who was more quiet and indifferent than usual since he woke up, as if he was thousands of miles away from people. On the contrary, Jinwan was much quieter these days. When they were about to return to the Mo family, Wanzhu took the servant who came with her to buy something, saying that she would make soup for them when they got back. Mo Xiaozi was not in this car, and the driver was also asked by Wanzhu to help carry the things. After they got out of the car, only Jinwan and Mo Jingshan were left. It was quiet in the car. In the past few days after Mo Jingshan woke up, his ward had been filled with people. She didn't know if the usually quiet man was deliberately trying to avoid spending time with her alone, but he allowed so many people to wander around his ward. So it was not until now that the two of them had a chance to be alone again. Chapter 369. However, before she could find a topic, Mo Jingshan, who had been sitting there with his eyes closed, spoke. We'll talk about the divorce when we return to High City. There's no need to mention it here. He did not open his eyes, but his indifferent voice was directed at Jinwan. Jinwan's face paled. Why do we have to divorce? At this time, the man opened his eyes, but there was no warmth in his indifferent eyes, cold and dark. Haven't we divorced before? But we haven't. The past is in the past for me. I only recognize the present. Jinwan looked at him and said firmly, I won't divorce. The man looked at her coldly. His distant and indifferent eyes were like icy thorns. Jinwan slowly clenched her hands and suddenly asked, or did you really marry another woman? She did not dare to ask whether it was Shuyan, Ji Menggran or anyone else. Just this tentative question had torn her heart into pieces, and she could barely put it back together. The man's black eyes looked at her and gradually emitted traces of mockery. What do you think? 4 simple words chilled Jinwan's heart to the bottom. Was he admitting it or was he simply mocking her? She couldn't understand these words at all. Just like the current Mo Jingshan, she couldn't understand him at all. This man was not a simple person to begin with, and now he was even more unfathomable and difficult to understand. She was silent for a moment, slowly clenched her hands on her lap and insisted, I won't divorce Mo Jingshan. Whether in America or back to High City, I won't divorce. The man looked at her coldly and did not speak again. At this time the car door had been opened. When Jinwan looked at him again, she saw that he had closed his eyes to rest again. Obviously, he did not intend to waste time on such a useless topic and quarrel with her. He didn't even want to say a word to her? Los Angeles, the Mo family. It was noon when they arrived at the Mo family home. The servants had prepared lunch. No one else followed them. When they got out of the car and walked into the Mo family home, they were alone. Ms. Wanzhou, who had been in a good mood all the way, entered the door with the servants carrying shopping bags. You've been eating hospital meals or takeout from nearby hotels these days. It's been a long time since you had a good meal at home. Hurry up and eat. Wanzhou said as she handed the shopping bags into the kitchen and told the servants to wash the bought ingredients. She would find time in the afternoon to cook. Then Wanzhou looked back at Jinwan, who seemed to be waiting for the elders to sit down. She smiled, walked over and sat down and motioned for Jinwan to sit next to Mo Jingshan. Jinwan glanced at Mo Jingshan before sitting down, only to see that the man was just sitting there silently and didn't look at her. Since he said he wouldn't mention the divorce in the Mo family, he probably didn't intend to keep too much distance from her. She hesitated for a moment and then sat down beside him. However, the distance between the dining chairs and their bodies was only about half a meter, but it felt like 10 years had passed. Beside her was a person that she could never reach even if she exhausted both of her lives. The servants served the lunch that they had prepared, filling up the entire table. Jinwan put a bowl of the medicated diet specially made for her and Mo Jingshan and put it in front of Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan glanced at it and didn't take it. Jingshan, get some chicken soup for Jinwan. She needs nourishment. Even if we go back to High City, ask Auntie Chen to make chicken soup for her every few days. It's best if it's black chicken soup. It's very good for women. Wanzhou said and winked at Mo Jingshan. Really, this guy used to love his wife so much, but after sleeping for 2 months he seemed to have become dull in love. Not only did he not spoil Jinwan as passionately as before, but he didn't even give her a bowl of chicken soup that was so close to his hand. Mo Jingshan didn't seem to hear her. Jinwan smiled to ease her embarrassment. No, I've drunk a lot these days. My mouth is almost spoiled by you. Don't you have more in the evening? I'll drink your soup tonight. This child, you're so sweet. You want to drink my soup, don't you? Then I'll make more for you tonight. Jinwan nodded, picked up a piece of fish tofu that was very close to her hand, and put it in Mo Jingshan's bowl. Mo Jingshan hadn't lifted his chopsticks yet. When their chopsticks collided, Jinwan saw that the fish tofu fell directly into his bowl and was about to take back her chopsticks. However, the man suddenly put down the chopsticks in his hand and said indifferently, "Bring me another pair of chopsticks." Jinwan. A minute later, she watched the man use the new pair of chopsticks to pick out the fish tofu she had just picked up and didn't eat it. Only then did Wanzhou and Mo Shaoza notice that there seemed to be something wrong between the two of them, but they just thought that the young couple might be quarreling. They didn't care about or participate in this kind of quarrel between husband and wife, so they didn't ask more questions but just smiled and asked them to eat more to nourish their bodies. Then Jinwan didn't continue to put food in Mo Jingshan's bowl. She ate some silently and put down the bowl, unable to eat any more. Why do you eat so little? Wanzhou asked. It's a lot. Jinwan didn't have an appetite, and now her appetite was even worse because of her mood. You've lost weight recently. Although I persuaded you to go back to the Mo family to rest in the days before Jingshan woke up, you ate very little every day. I felt sorry for you when I saw you didn't eat or sleep well. Now that Jingshan is fine, why do you still eat so little? Wanzhou said as she put some more food in Jinwan's bowl. Good girl, eat more. You can't lose weight like this. Jinwan had to eat a little more, but she really couldn't eat any more and put down the chopsticks after a few more mouthfuls. At this time, Mo Jingshan got up to answer the phone. Jinwan sat at the table and was about to get up, when Wanzhou suddenly asked in a voice that only she could hear, "Did you quarrel with Jingshan?" Jinwan paused and shook her head. No. If it was just a quarrel it would be fine, but now Mo Jingshan didn't even want to quarrel with her. Wanju had obviously seen Mo Jingshan treat Jinwan so well a while ago, but now he suddenly treated Jinwan coldly. Although she felt it was a little strange to see Mo Jingshan being so cold in front of his wife, she still comforted Jinwan. Don't take it to heart. It's inevitable that there will be friction between husband and wife. Be patient. If Jingshan bullies you after returning to High City, call me and I'll fly over to help you. Chapter 370. In the afternoon, Mo Jingshan and Mo Xiaoza talked about Shine Group, while Jinwan followed Wanju around the Mo home. In the evening, she went to the kitchen with Wanju to pick vegetables. The servants of the Mo family were used to the hostess taking the initiative to go to the kitchen. They cleaned up everything in the kitchen and let the two of them work as much as they wanted. After dinner, Jinwan went back to the bedroom. She wanted to wait for Mo Jingshan to come back to have a good talk with him. But after waiting for a long time, he didn't return to the bedroom. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening, so Jinwan had to go to the bathroom to take a shower. Halfway through the shower, she vaguely heard the bedroom door open and close. Her heart paused, knowing that Mo Jingshan had come in. She didn't dawdle, sped up the shower, wrapped herself in a bath towel, and went straight out of the bathroom. As soon as she went out, she saw the man standing neatly dressed in the bedroom. Apparently, he turned his eyes because he heard the sound in the bathroom. When he saw the bath towel on Jinwan, his eyes were cold. Put on your clothes and then come out. Jinwan, they had been married for so long. Wasn't it normal to come out with a bath towel wrapped around her? She used to be carried into the bathroom after being harshly bullied by him on the bed, and then he carried her out naked. What did she say at that time? Jinwan thought about it, picked up her clothes, went back to the bathroom, put on her pajamas and blew her hair until it was half dry. When she came out, she saw that Mo Jingshan was standing in front of the bedroom window. Outside the window was a huge balcony. He didn't go out. His slender figure stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. His back was familiar but also strange. She ran her fingers through her half-dry hair and walked over. Can we have a good talk? It's getting late. Go to sleep. I'll go to the study to deal with some business after taking a shower. Mo Jingshan didn't look at her. When Jinwan approached, he avoided her and turned to the study. Jinwan was silent for a moment and asked, "Aren't you going to sleep?" The man's back was cold and full of alienation. "You sleep on the bed. I'll sleep in the study." His answer was decisive and straightforward, and even the last connection between husband and wife with Jinwan seemed to be severed by him in an instant. The sound of water came from the bathroom. Jinwan was still standing in front of the window. She turned to look at the bathroom and took a long time to calm down before she went to get 2 sets of clothes, walked over and gently knocked on the bathroom door. The sound of water in the bathroom immediately stopped. "What is it?" The man's deep and cold voice came from inside. "You didn't take a change of clothes out. Put it at the door. It's a bit cold in the room. It's better to come out after you're done. I'll bring it in for you." "No need." For a moment, Jinwan heard a hint of decisiveness in his voice. She gritted her teeth. Today she had been provoked by Mo Jingshan. "Are you afraid that you have too many wounds and don't want me to see them, or do you want to keep a distance from me to the point where we can't even be husband and wife?" There was silence in the bathroom and the sound of water continued. Obviously, he had no intention of answering her. Jinwan angrily put his clothes down on the table in front of the door and turned back to the bed. When she sat down on the bed, she did not lift the quilt to lie down but just stared at the bathroom, listening to the sound of water in it. She was really angry, but she didn't know whether to be angry at herself for pushing this man so far away or at Mo Jingshan, who could be so heartless now. Jinwan picked up her cell phone and flipped through it. The text messages she had sent him when he was unconscious were all read. He saw them all, but he didn't reply to her text messages, nor did he reply verbally. Was it because when he opened his eyes again he had already remembered everything in the past, so when he saw her dozens of messages, it was as if he was watching a huge joke? When the sound of water stopped, Jinwan stared at the bathroom. Not long after, the man opened the door, took in a change of clothes and came out dressed. His hair had been dried but it was still a little wet. His ink-black hair seemed to have a faint cold brilliance, as if Jinwan did not exist in this bathroom. After coming out, he went straight into the study. Jinwan remembered that when she had just been reborn, it wasn't easy for her to coax Mo Jingshan home from the company, but he also lived in the study or slept in another bedroom. 10 years ago, they slept in separate rooms because she wanted a divorce, and he avoided her temper and let her sleep alone. As long as she changed her ideas and practices and tried to cherish the life with him, The pace of their marriage would slowly return to happiness and stability. But 10 years later they had divorced and hadn't seen each other for 10 years. How could she stand by Mo Jingshan's side? He had long been the global executive president of the Shine Group, a superior who was much more powerful than the Mo Corporation. His calmness, indifference, heartlessness, and means were definitely more unpredictable than what he had been 10 years ago. He controlled everything, but no one could control him anymore. The Mo Jingshan she knew was him, but now Mo Jingshan had become the one she was extremely unfamiliar with. She couldn't understand, let alone understand. The two of them were very close, but they seemed to be separated by thousands of mountains and rivers. The door of the study was closed. She couldn't see inside, but she really couldn't sleep, so she sat on the bed and took out a box of burn ointment from the drawer. She had never had the patience to apply this thing. The doctor also said that the burn marks on her hands would disappear naturally in a few months. If she insisted on applying this ointment, they would disappear faster. She slowly applied the ointment on her hands, and a faint medicinal fragrance came into her nose. She stared at her hands and suddenly couldn't remember when was the last time she held hands with Mo Jingshan. It seemed that it had been a long time. Last time, at that dinner party, he had been holding her hand tightly and keeping her by his side, never far away. But at this moment, not to mention holding hands, even touching chopsticks made him want to change to a new pair. As if she were a plague. Even when they slept, they didn't sleep in the same room. Jin Wan resisted the throbbing pain in her heart. Considering that Mo Jingshan had just been discharged from the hospital and needed to rest in a comfortable bed more than she did, she got up and sat down on the fabric sofa in the bedroom. After looking at her phone for a while, she looked up at the door of the study, which was closed and quiet. It was like an insurmountable barrier. Chapter 371. For some reason, Jin Wan felt as though everything had returned to the past. She opened her eyes in a daze, watching the person so close to her. After a long while, she gradually woke up. When she raised her eyes again, she saw the man's gaze on her. It was a very, very faint gaze. She did not know how long he had been standing here and how long he had been watching her. "Are you done?" She resisted the urge to lean into his arms at such a close distance and asked sleepily. "Why didn't you sleep on the bed?" The man's low and cold voice was even colder than the night outside the window. Jin Wan woke up again and tugged the thin blanket covering her. She was still curled up on the sofa, but because she had just woken up, her nasal voice was very heavy. "You've just been discharged from the hospital. It shouldn't be comfortable to sleep in the study. So, I'll let you sleep on the bed." The man silently watched her for a moment and said calmly, "In my upbringing, there's no such thing as a man sleeping on the bed and a woman sleeping on the sofa. Go back to the bed." The first sentence was somewhat distant and polite, but the last sentence was like a command. It was very similar to the Mo Jingshan who usually urged her to eat and sleep. Jin Wan was quiet. She gripped the corner of the blanket, her voice slightly hoarse. "Between us, when did we reach the point where we need to be so polite?" The man's pitch-black and calm eyes watched her quietly. "Otherwise, do you want to sleep on the bed with me? Or do you want something to happen between us tonight? We're husband and wife, aren't we?" Jin Wan directly looked into his eyes. However, the man's indifferent gaze quickly made her realize that she was being unrequited. "I'm afraid you haven't found your place." The man's unique cold fragrance was right in front of her, but after saying this, he directly turned and walked away. Finally, the door to the study opened and closed. Jin Wan curled up on the sofa, watching the door and then turning to look at the empty bed. During this period, Mo Jingshan and Jin Wan were like strangers. However, the Mo family gradually exerted pressure on the Su family, causing the Su family to seal off the news. Even Elder Su could not control the invisible net that was being cast on his granddaughter. When Elder Su could no longer bear it and directly came to the Mo family, Mo Jingshan did not avoid him. However, there was a hint of a smile in his dark eyes. This smile was unfathomable. He had always been a person that Elder Su could not understand and deal with. At this moment, he especially felt that Mo Jingshan, who had only woken up after sleeping for 2 whole months, seemed to be even more decisive and ruthless than before. "Shui has already died in that car. This case can't be closed just like that. Do you really want to fight to the death with our Su family?" Elder Su looked at Mo Shaoza, who had gradually found out the truth, and then at Mo Jingshan. He gritted his teeth and tried to fight for more opportunities for Su Jilan. However, Mo Jingshan only coldly curved his lips. Everything went on as usual. In the days after Mo Jingshan woke up, the Su family had been turned upside down. When Elder Su wanted to come again, he could no longer see Mo Jingshan. The Mo family's door and Shine's door had also clearly forbidden the Su family. In the 3 days before returning to High City, the evidence that Su Jilan had hired a hitman to kill Su Jilan was more accurately confirmed. All the medicine Su Shui had taken before her death, all the hospital diagnoses, and all the evidence related to Su Jilan's plan were laid out one by one. In the face of the Mo family's means and evidence, Elder Su was powerless. Su Jilan was grounded in the Su family as a suspect and taken to the police station. All the evidence of the crime was presented one by one. She could not defend herself no matter how hard she tried to find an excuse. Knowing that the real murderer behind the scenes might really be Su Jilan, Su Shui's parents flew into a rage and ran to the police station to expose many things of the Su family, including many things between Su Jilan and Su Shui. Jinwan lost a child. So within a week after Mo Jingshan woke up, the Su family completely changed. Su Jilan was convicted. Elder Su was so angry that he fell into a coma and was sent to the hospital for emergency treatment. Su Shui was finally able to leave the Forensic Institute and was taken home by her parents to be buried. Mo Jingshan's swift and decisive actions, as well as his precise judgment and means, made Mo Xiaozi feel ashamed of his inferiority. He asked him several times when he would come back to take over Shine. In the past, Mo Jingshan would never answer this question. Before returning to High City, Mo Jingshan watched Jin Wan get into the car and said after a long time, "Don't touch my people. In 2 years the Mo Corporation will merge with Shine, and 2 years later I will take over Shine." Mo Xiaozi raised his eyebrows and looked at him abruptly. "Are you sure?" Mo Jingshan's cold voice gradually became full of sarcasm. "If I don't come back to take over Shine in 2 years, I'm afraid that with the prestige you have built up and the penetration rate in recent years, you won't be able to resist the attack of the 2 internet companies, VK and Huahong. Give me 2 years and they will collapse in front of the Mo Corporation. They won't even be qualified to compete with Shine." Although Shine was the largest Chinese company in the Chinese world in the United States, in recent years, there had been major changes in the domestic and foreign industries, and many of them were turning to the internet and technology. At his age, Mo Xiaozi didn't know much about these things and his penetration rate was very low. If Shine continued to be in his hands in a few years, it would fall in the torrent of these industry changes sooner or later. It was not as promising as the Mo Corporation that Mo Jingshan had supported, so it was indeed the best choice for Mo Corporation to merge with Shine and let Mo Jingshan take over. However, Mo Jingshan had never given a direct response, so Mo Xiaozi had always thought that he would never take over Shine and had been worried whether the Mo family's century-old foundation would be destroyed in his hands. And now Mo Jingshan's words had put Mo Xiaozi's mind at ease. When they got on the plane back to High City at the same time as Mo Jingshan, Feng Ling had a mission in the United States and would go to High City to see Jinwan after a while. The plane had been flying for several hours. The blue sky and white clouds outside the window looked so beautiful, but the man beside Jinwan remained silent. The two boarded the plane together in front of Wanzhou and Mo Xiaozi. After getting on the plane, the man didn't say a word to her. Chapter 372. Mo Jingshan recovered quickly. Perhaps sleeping motionlessly like this for 2 months really left a lot of space for the wounds on his body to heal, unlike before when his wounds were torn open at any time. Now, except that he was a little thinner than when he was in High City, he was no different from before. He was still as cold and noble as she remembered, and still the man she was familiar with. The only difference was that he no longer smiled at her, and his gaze no longer lingered on her. Even though they were sitting on the same plane, even though the two of them were sitting in the same row and he was right next to her, it felt like they were very, very far apart. Jinwan sat for a while and suddenly put her hand on his leg. The man opened his eyes and stared at her with heavy eyes. "What are you doing?" Jinwan looked at her hand on his leg and then at his displeased, heavy eyes. She pursed her lips and said, "Excuse me. I want to go to the bathroom." Even though the first-class seats were spacious, he was tall and had long legs and he was sitting on the outside of the aisle. If he didn't step aside, she wouldn't be able to go out at all. Mo Jingshan took another look at her and moved his leg away. Jinwan withdrew her hand resentfully. When she got up, the plane must have passed through an area with turbulence. Perhaps unintentionally or perhaps intentionally, Jinwan staggered and fell into his arms. Although she didn't fall so hard, she still pressed her hands on his legs and leaned forward, almost leaning into his arms, and their faces were only a finger's distance apart. At such a distance, the man looked at her deadpan. Jinwan's heart pounded, but she said calmly, Sorry, I didn't stand still. Mo Jingshan. Before getting up, Jin Wan's hand purposely pressed down hard on his thigh. She pressed down hard on this golden thigh that she was not allowed to touch earlier before getting up. She turned and went to the private restroom not far from the first-class cabin. Standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, Jin Wan smiled at the mirror. She felt that her smile was not very good, so she raised her hand to pull up the corners of her mouth. She didn't put down her hand until she was satisfied with it. They were going back to High City, back to their original world, their original life. Divorce? Of course she wouldn't. But if she kept being alienated by him like this, it seemed that she couldn't maintain the status quo forever. In this marriage, self-esteem, face and strength were not important. Besides, Mo Jingshan had done everything for her, whether she was aware of it or not. Not long ago he had almost died for her. If she compromised and left so easily now, she would really let him and herself down. Since they were husband and wife, it was a legal relationship. At most, he would let her chase after him. If he retreated, she would advance. If he was cold, she would warm. If he avoided, she would take the initiative. If he was expressionless, she would smile. As Mrs. Mo, couldn't she climb into his bed legally? As long as she wanted to take the initiative, no matter how powerful he would not be able to remove her from the spouse column unless she agreed to a divorce. Jin Wan smiled at the mirror for a while. Feeling that her smile was natural and beautiful, she walked out. When she returned to her seat, the moment Mo Jingshan got up, Jin Wan happened to walk past him. She looked up at his cold face and suddenly stood on tiptoe to whisper in his ear, "Honey, after several days of careful consideration, I finally made up my mind." Hearing this, the man glanced at her calmly, his eyes a little like looking at a lunatic. Jin Wan had prepared herself and was ready to fight back. Facing his eyes, she smiled and looked into his quiet black eyes, saying in a low voice, "I've decided, even if you put a knife to my neck, I won't agree to divorce you." The man was expressionless just now, but because of her words, he became as cold as usual. Without waiting for him to speak, Jin Wan slipped back to her seat, fastened her seat belt, picked up a magazine in front of her, and flipped through it, looking forward to flying back to High City as soon as possible. Mo Jingshan didn't say anything, and on the plane he didn't intend to discuss too much with her about a divorce. After reading the magazine for a while, Jin Wan patted him and asked him to ask the flight attendant for a glass of water, a blanket, or a headset. Almost every half an hour she would try to talk to him. Although the man always turned a blind eye to her, Jin Wan still happily patted his hand after half an hour. Mo Jingshan's expression became colder and he glanced at her. Jin Wan put the magazine in front of him solemnly, pointed to the French paragraph on the last page of the magazine and asked, "I haven't learned French, so I don't know this. Don't you know many languages? What's this paragraph about?" The man looked at her clumsy acting skills and pure attitude of trying to find something to talk about and completely ignored her. Jin Wan pointed to the French paragraph and asked, "Just translate it into Chinese for me. I don't think it's very long. It's just 2 or 3 sentences at most." Mo Jingshan glanced at the words she was pointing at. His gaze deepened, but he did not translate it for her. The plane would land in High City in about 3 hours. Jin Wan kept looking at the passage. On the other side of the aisle sat a French student with a Chinese-French dictionary in his hand. Jin Wan borrowed the dictionary and read it word by word. Finally, she took a pen and wrote down the translated content on her boarding pass. Koi kilspas sayin personatamari element, alarevian dratager save cledums. No matter what happens, if someone truly loves you as time passes, she will eventually come back. Jin Wan returned the dictionary to the French student and then placed the words she had just written in front of Mo Jingshan. She looked at him with a burning gaze. "Did I translate it correctly?" Mo Jingshan glanced at the row of beautiful words she had written on the boarding pass and did not speak for a long time. His gaze was cold and indifferent. In the end, when Jin Wan approached to ask him, he looked at her. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, enough to cut her. His tone was indifferent. There are many ways to interpret French. People who think they're passionate will usually translate a simple sentence into something extremely romantic. In short, it's all because they're passionate. Chapter 373. High City. It had only been a few short months, but it felt like half a lifetime ago. As soon as he returned, Mo Jingshan went straight to the Mo Corporation. He did not even return to the U Garden, nor did he ask about Jin Wan. Jin Wan returned to the U Garden to tidy up and planned to go to the Ji home. Before returning, she learned that Ji Hongwen had been discharged. Recently, the G Corporation had been handed over to the vice president to manage, and Ji Hongwon would most likely be resting at home for a while. Before returning to the Ji home, she called Mo Jingshin, only to find that his private number was turned off. Not many people called his private number. Even if grandfather Mo wanted to call him, he would usually call his work number, office phone, or directly call the Yu Garden's landline. This number was usually used to contact her. She called Shin Mu, only to learn that Mo Jingshin went straight to the conference room after going to the company. He had not returned for a long time, and there were many problems waiting for him to deal with. Jin Wan did not receive Mo Jingshin's call the entire afternoon. Even when Shin Mu told him that she had called, he did not call her back. Before the sky turned dark, Jin Wan returned to the Ji family. Ji Hongwon's health was much better. Ever since she went to T-City, she hadn't been back for about half a year. There was still no news from Ji Menggran. It had only been half a year, but Ji Hongwon seemed to have aged 10 years. Shin Mu said that CEO Mo would most likely have a meeting tonight. It was uncertain if it would end before noon tomorrow, so she did not plan to return tonight and simply stayed at the Ji home to accompany Ji Hongwon. Shin Haru had already been chased away. It was said that not long after she was chased away, she was picked up by Sheng Yihan. As expected, this pair of mother and son had not truly severed their mother-son relationship after so many years. Ji Hongwon still needed to rest for a while. Jin Wan found that he would watch the aviation news before going to bed. Although he did not say it, Ji Menggran was his biological daughter after all. She had been missing for so long without any news, and it had not been confirmed that she had really died. He had always been worried about her. Therefore, she also checked the news before going to bed and found that Ji Menggran really seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was no news of her anywhere. Her name was not on the list of victims of the plane crash. Even at the airline press conference, no one mentioned her name. Mo Jingshin held meetings in the company for several days, and Jin Wan stayed at the Ji home for a few days. Ji Hongwon was able to get out of bed occasionally because of her return and company. When spring came, he would often walk around the front yard with Jin Wan's help, or sit in a wheelchair and be pushed by Jin Wan to the nearby shopping malls, supermarkets, parks and other places to relax. A week later, Ji Hongwon's physical and mental condition were much better, and he decided to return to the company after a few more days of rest. Jin Wan took some time to go to the studio. In the evening, she was dragged downstairs by Xia Tian and Xiao Ba to eat a lot of food, and her stomach was almost bursting. After returning to the Yu Garden by car, Auntie Chin asked her if she wanted to eat. Jin Wan rubbed her stomach and shook her head. "No, I ate too much at night. Now I can't even drink a mouthful of water." Auntie Chin smiled and asked her to take advantage of the good weather tonight to take a stroll in the Yu Garden to digest. However, Jin Wan knew that Mo Jingshin did not continue the meeting today and thought that he would return to the Yu Garden today, but she went upstairs and searched all the bedrooms but found no trace of him. "Hasn't Mo Jingshin come back these days?" Jin Wan asked. "No. He hasn't come back these days when I'm not here?" No. It had been a week since he returned to High City. He could attend meetings and work overtime, but since there was no meeting today, he didn't even plan to return to the Yu Garden? Was he trying to avoid the opportunity to meet her? Jin Wan thought about it. Although she didn't know if he was really busy, and she was not the kind of person who was particularly used to calling often, she still picked up her cell phone and called Mo Jingshin. His private number was still turned off. She dialed the number of his studio. The phone rang for a long time but no one answered. But now it was time to get off work, and Jin Wan couldn't disturb Shin Mu at this time. She hesitated, and without taking off her coat or changing her shoes, she turned and went out. "Hey Mrs. Mo, you just came back and you're leaving again?" Auntie Chin finally saw the hostess of the house come back. Seeing Jin Wan turn and leave again, she was worried and hurriedly chased after her to ask. "I'll go to the Mo Corporation to have a look," Jin Wan replied, went straight to the parking lot and drove out by herself. Seeing Jin Wan drive the car away, Auntie Chin stood on the spot and sighed. Although Mrs. Mo didn't live in the Yu Garden these days, if it were in the past, Mr. Mo would definitely find time to call back and ask if Jin Wan had returned to the Yu Garden. However, these days Jin Wan returned to the Ji family, but Mr. Mo not only didn't return to the Yu Garden, but also didn't even call. The white Audi sped along the road. It didn't take long to drive to the Mo Corporation. Jin Wan stopped the car, got out of the car and closed the door. She stood in the square opposite the Mo Corporation building for a while, looking at the top floor which was not lit. She hesitated before walking in. She went to the company's security room and asked if Mo Jingshin was in the company. The security guard knew Jin Wan and knew that she was Mrs. Mo, so he answered truthfully, "Co is not in the company." Not in the company? Then where did he go? I saw his car was still there. Jin Wan glanced at the familiar black ghost in the parking lot. Mo has been in meetings for several days in a row, and it's rare for him to take a break today. He planned to live in the office break room, but some time ago the office glass on each floor of the company was reinforced, and some simple new decoration was carried out. There may be some smell of solidified glue, so Mo didn't live here. Okay, thank you. Jin Wan didn't ask more, turned to walk down the steps, and then looked in the direction of Aolan International, which was not far from the Mo Corporation. As far as she knew, apart from the U Garden, the only place where he lived was Aolan International. If he didn't drive, only Aolan International was the nearest place. She didn't continue driving. Instead, she turned around and walked in that direction. When she crossed the road, her eyes fell on the fruit store across the road. She then glanced at the supermarket below the apartment building and went in to buy some fruits and ingredients. When she was buying ingredients in the supermarket, she handed over the money to the shop owner. The shop owner clearly remembered her. After all, Mo Jingshan had come here with her. At that time he bought some onions, ginger and garlic and handed a black card to the proprietress. After shopping, Jin Wan entered the apartment, entered the elevator and went upstairs. When she arrived at the floor where Mo Jingshan lived, as soon as she walked out, she saw that the door of the apartment was closed. Although she knew the password and could unlock the door with her fingerprint, she still raised her hand and rang the doorbell. Chapter 374. The man was damp, handsome and clean. It seemed that the coldness of these days had faded away in an instant. His hair was half wet, and his eyes were calm and he seemed to have become the old Mo Jingshan again. However, the moment he saw that the person standing outside the door was her, his eyes turned cold. What are you doing here? Obviously, he had been busy in the company for several days and held meetings for several days. He should have just returned to Aolan International to rest. There was more or less some fatigue in his eyes, but the coldness in his black eyes was as cold as ever. Andy Chin said you haven't been back to the U Garden these days. I know you haven't been back to the company for a long time and have a lot of things to deal with. You must be busy and tired these days. Just now, I passed by your company and heard that you had left, so I guessed you should be here, so I bought some food and necessities. You must have come back in a hurry and didn't buy them. Jin Wan said and showed him the shopping bag in her hand. Mo Jingshan's eyes swept over her face indifferently. Because of her passing by, he seemed to be a little sarcastic, but he didn't expose her. Can I come in? The man was silent for 2 seconds and said coldly, If I say no, will you leave now? Of course I won't leave. Then she saw the man's slightly mocking expression, and then he turned and walked in. Although he left the door open for her, he didn't mean to welcome her. At the moment he turned around, Jin Wan finally saw the wounds on his back. Although the wounds had already healed, there were still scars left behind, regardless of whether it was light or heavy. She didn't know how long it would take for these wounds and scars to disappear, but each of them had left an indelible mark in Jin Wan's life. No matter how he treated her now, he was Mo Jingshan, her Mo Jingshan. How could she give up so easily, and how could she escape because of these little setbacks? Jin Wan went straight into the door. Nothing in Aolan International had changed. That's right. She hadn't lived here for so long and he hadn't come back either. Usually, there wouldn't be any changes except that someone would come and clean the place. Mo Jingshan went back to the bathroom to continue drying his hair. Jin Wan took the things she bought into the kitchen, and when she came out, Mo Jingshan had entered the bedroom. He didn't even look at her, as if her arrival was like a servant or a nanny who had just come back from shopping, and he didn't need to worry about asking or answering a word or half a sentence. Jin Wan simply asked him through the bedroom door, Have you finished all the work that has piled up in the company? The bedroom was quiet. There was no response. Jin Wan asked again, When do you plan on returning to the U Garden? Not long after, the bedroom door opened, and the tall and slender man came out. He was no longer only wearing a bath towel. He had put on a shirt and black pants. Jin Wan found that since he woke up, he seemed to be wearing black, and the light-colored or white shirts he occasionally wore were almost untouched. Was it because he was only used to wearing black in the following years? In the past, when he wore this color, he only looked noble and aloof, making it hard for people to get close to him. Now, looking at him, it felt like he was a cold machine, emotionless and emotionless. It was like a black barrier had been erected between them, and she couldn't get close even if she wanted to. Because Jin Wan had been staring at him, Mo Jingshan walked out of the bedroom and was about to pick up the phone, but because of her gaze he turned to look at her. It was a very indifferent look, as if he was troubled by the sudden appearance of another person in his place. You've been here and you've seen it. Why don't you leave? It's raining outside. I've lived here before and even the password is my birthday. I'll stay here with you tonight, can't I? Jinwan asked in a matter-of-fact tone. Mo Jingshan looked out of the window. High City had entered spring and the spring rain was biting. Jinwan's body couldn't stand the cold, so it was best not to go out at this time. He didn't say more, put down the phone he had just picked up, and seemed to hesitate for half a second before picking it up again. At the same time he picked up the suit jacket on the sofa, put it in the crook of his arm and straightened up to leave. Jinwan stared at his back and suddenly stepped forward. When he was about to go out, she suddenly jumped up to him, put her back against the door and stared at him. Where are you going? Because of her actions, Mo Jingshan faintly furrowed his cold brows. Move aside. It's raining outside. Are you going out? You stay here. I'll go back to the company. Jinwan stared at him, and if her eyes could shoot fire, she really wanted to roast his frozen heart. Mo Jingshan, is there a virus in me? Do you have to hide from me like this? Although Aolan International is not the U Garden, it is also our common home, isn't it? You set the password of this apartment door by yourself. You set my birthday, which means you agree that this apartment belongs to the two of us. Now because I'm here you want to leave? The man pursed his lips indifferently and looked at her eyes that had been staring at him. I'll change the password. Jinwan widened her eyes. You want to change the password? Mo Jingshan didn't talk nonsense and said impatiently, get out of the way. I won't get out of the way. Jinwan stubbornly guarded the door. Do you want to leave? Do you want to keep a distance from me? All right, no matter how high the floor here is, it can't be as high as the 33rd floor. If you have the ability, jump down or climb down yourself. Anyway, I even dare to climb up to the 33rd floor. To avoid me, what's there to be afraid of? Go jump down yourself. Go jump. I won't stop you. The man's eyes were fixed on her face. Perhaps because of her words, he was silent for a few seconds, but after a few seconds, he still looked cold and ruthless. Jinwan, pestering me won't do you any good. Don't be so unreasonable. I'm protecting my marriage. I'm stopping my man from leaving me. Is this pestering? Mo Jingshan, I'm your wife. Soon I won't be, he said indifferently. I've been too busy to deal with your problem these days. Now that you've come to find me, I'll go back to the company tomorrow morning and bring the divorce agreement to you. Remember to sign it. Jinwan looked at him and said clearly, I won't divorce you. Never. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.